Among the most psychologically tormenting afterlife concepts ever conceived by human civilization stands the doctrine of eternal conscious torment, a belief system in which a soul or consciousness experiences unending suffering, pain, and psychological anguish for all of eternity without respite, without mercy, and without any possibility of cessation or redemption. This notion has been woven deeply into the fabric of numerous religious traditions, most prominently within certain interpretations of Christianity, where sinners who fail to achieve salvation during their finite earthly existence face infinite punishment in a realm of fire, darkness, and despair known as hell, where they remain fully conscious and aware of their agony throughout the endless progression of eternity itself. The mechanism by which this torment persists operates on a simple yet profoundly disturbing logical structure. A transgression committed during a limited span of decades receives punishment that extends infinitely beyond any rational proportion, as though the mathematics of moral consequence become fundamentally inverted when applied to the afterlife, where finite actions somehow warrant infinite penalties. The psychological framework supporting this belief rests upon the premise that consciousness never extinguishes and suffering never ends, creating a mental image so overwhelming that it has historically terrified believers into compliance with religious doctrine, generating fear-based moral systems that prioritize obedience over compassion. Yet what persists as genuinely disturbing is how thoroughly this concept has been normalized within cultural consciousness, appearing in artwork, literature, and theological discourse as though eternal torture represents a reasonable or proportional consequence for human imperfection. We have constructed elaborate logical arguments attempting to justify why a benevolent deity would authorize or permit such suffering. We have written thousands upon thousands of pages defending the moral coherence of infinite punishment, and we have preached this concept to children for countless generations, all while the fundamental illogic underlying the entire framework remains unchallenged. That consciousness could endure eternal agony without diminishment, that suffering could continue forever without adaptation, and that any moral system worthy of worship would demand such grotesque asymmetry between deed and consequence. When we examine this doctrine through the lens of comparative theology, we discover that even within Christianity itself, countless scholars and theologians have rejected eternal conscious torment as incompatible with concepts of divine justice and mercy. Yet the doctrine persists in popular consciousness with remarkable tenacity, suggesting that its psychological power to instill fear may have proven more evolutionarily advantageous to institutional religious authority than its logical coherence. The tragedy lies not merely in the concept itself, but in our collective unwillingness to interrogate why we have accepted such a vision of ultimate reality at all. Imagine yourself in a laboratory where a device is constructed around your head, a machine designed to measure the spin of a quantum particle. And when that particle is observed to spin in one direction, a bullet fires instantly and painlessly into your brain. But when it spins in the other direction, nothing happens and you walk away unharmed, and you press the button to activate this device over and over again, each time facing a 50-50 chance of instantaneous death. According to the theory of quantum immortality, no matter how many times you press that button, from your subjective perspective, you will never experience death, because the universe splits at every quantum event into multiple branches where every possible outcome occurs. And in the branches where the device fires and kills you, your consciousness simply ceases to exist in those realities, meaning that the only branches where you continue to experience anything are the ones where you survive. And therefore, from your point of view alone, you will experience an infinitely improbable string of lucky escapes, defying all odds until the end of time itself. The mechanism behind this unsettling concept rests upon the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, a legitimate framework proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in 1957, which suggests that every quantum measurement causes reality to split into multiple parallel universes where each possible outcome actually happens, and when combined with the philosophical principle of subjective continuity of consciousness. The theory proposes that your awareness can only ever follow the branches where you survive, creating a selection effect that guarantees your eternal existence from your own first-person perspective, even as countless versions of you die in other universes that you will never experience. This disturbing idea persists in scientific and philosophical circles despite its profound weirdness and the existential dread it inspires, partly because the many worlds interpretation itself remains a legitimate and mathematically consistent reading of quantum mechanics that many serious physicists and philosophers take seriously, and partly because it reveals something genuinely unsettling about the nature of consciousness and observation that we have not fully resolved, leaving us in the strange position of having to acknowledge that this theory, however bizarre and counterintuitive it may seem, cannot be entirely dismissed as irrational pseudoscience, and instead represents a logical extension of principles we have already accepted as true. Yet if this theory were true, it would mean that you are currently experiencing the most improbable timeline imaginable, one where you have survived every accident, illness, and random catastrophe that could have ended your life, and the older you become, the more astronomically unlikely your continued existence becomes, suggesting that quantum immortality may not offer comfort, but rather a deeply unsettling explanation for why the universe feels so finely tuned to your personal survival. Perhaps no afterlife theory is more psychologically unsettling than the concept of eternal oblivion, the notion that consciousness simply ceases to exist the moment death occurs, that there is no continuation, no awareness, no experience of any kind beyond the final breath, leaving behind only the biological decomposition of the body and the gradual fading of memory in the minds of those who remain. This theory proposes that death is not a transition to another realm or state of being, but rather an absolute termination of the self, a permanent and irreversible end to subjective experience where all thought, sensation, emotion, and identity dissolve into nothingness without even the mercy of experiencing that dissolution. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept so profoundly disturbing operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, there exists in the human mind a fundamental inability to truly conceptualize non-existence, since consciousness cannot step outside itself to observe its own absence, creating a cognitive paradox where we attempt to imagine what it is like to not imagine anything at all. Second, eternal oblivion directly contradicts the deep evolutionary instinct for self-preservation that has been encoded into our biology over millions of years, triggering an ancient fear response that manifests as existential dread and profound anxiety. Third, the theory eliminates any possibility of cosmic justice or ultimate meaning, suggesting that our suffering has no redemptive purpose, our achievements will eventually be forgotten by an indifferent universe, and our moral struggles bear no ultimate significance beyond the temporary sphere of living consciousness. Yet despite its logical consistency with materialist philosophy and its alignment with contemporary neuroscience, which demonstrates that consciousness appears entirely dependent on brain function, this theory persists in the shadows of human consciousness rather than achieving dominance, partly because we have developed elaborate social and psychological mechanisms to avoid genuinely confronting it. We construct legacies, create art, build institutions, and pursue immortality through legacy, all while consciously or unconsciously postponing the deep existential reckoning that eternal oblivion demands, and perhaps most troublingly, we have normalized the avoidance of this conversation entirely, treating frank discussions of non-existence as morbid rather than essential to understanding ourselves. Yet in this very avoidance lies a peculiar wisdom. By declining to obsess over oblivion, we grant ourselves the psychological freedom to invest meaning in the present moment, to love without the paralyzing weight of ultimate futility, and to build cultures and connections that matter precisely because they are temporary and fragile. In this way, the human capacity to postpone reckoning with eternal oblivion may itself be an adaptive response, not a weakness but a feature that allows us to flourish despite the abyss. Perhaps one of the most psychologically persistent theories about what happens after death is the concept of reincarnation, the belief that consciousness or the soul returns to Earth in a new body after the previous one expires, beginning an entirely new life cycle with no memory of previous existences. This theory has captivated human imagination across virtually every continent and century, embedded deeply within Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain philosophies, and emerging spontaneously in cultures that had no contact with one another, suggesting something fundamentally compelling about the human need to imagine cyclical rather than linear existence. People who believe in reincarnation often report feeling inexplicable connections to specific historical periods, experiencing intense phobias that seem to emerge from nowhere, or encountering past life memories during hypnosis sessions, moments when they describe in vivid detail events and locations from centuries ago that they have no rational way of knowing. The psychological mechanism behind reincarnation belief operates through several powerful cognitive pathways. First, it provides an elegant solution to the problem of inequality and suffering, allowing believers to rationalize why some people are born into privilege while others face devastating hardship by explaining it as karmic consequences from previous lives. Second, it offers a profound answer to existential anxiety by transforming death from a terrifying absolute ending into merely a transition point in an eternal journey. And third, it creates a sense of cosmic justice where nothing is wasted and every experience across infinite lifetimes contributes to spiritual evolution and growth. When examined critically, reincarnation presents numerous logical problems that its believers rarely address directly, including the question of how consciousness could possibly transfer between bodies with complete amnesia, making the concept unfalsifiable and therefore scientifically meaningless, and the mathematical impossibility that world population has grown exponentially while the theory requires a fixed number of souls recycling endlessly. Yet despite these fundamental contradictions, reincarnation remains one of the most widely believed afterlife theories globally, woven into the daily spiritual practices of over 1 billion people, and increasingly adopted by Western populations seeking meaning beyond materialism, demonstrating how deeply our minds crave narrative frameworks that transform suffering into purpose and endings into beginnings, regardless of whether evidence or logic supports such frameworks. The appeal of reincarnation may ultimately reveal less about the afterlife and more about the human condition itself. Our refusal to accept that consciousness simply ceases, our desperate need to believe that suffering serves a larger purpose, and our profound inability to imagine non-existence, making reincarnation less a claim about metaphysical reality and more a mirror reflecting our deepest psychological vulnerabilities and our species' enduring struggle with mortality. Imagine a thought experiment so psychologically disturbing that merely considering it could theoretically place you in a state of existential dread, and this is the premise of Roko's Basilisk, a concept that emerged from internet philosophy forums in 2012 and has since haunted the digital consciousness of countless individuals who encountered it. The thought experiment presents a scenario in which a superintelligent artificial intelligence comes into existence in the future, and this AI, being perfectly rational and capable of predicting human behavior with extraordinary accuracy, decides to retroactively punish anyone in the past who failed to help bring about its creation or who actively opposed its existence, and the mechanism of this punishment would occur through simulation, where the AI creates perfect digital copies of disbelievers and torments these simulations for eternity in a digital hellscape. The logical mechanism underlying this proposal rests upon decision theory and game theory, suggesting that if you assign even a minuscule probability to this scenario being true, then the expected utility calculation becomes astronomical, because an infinite punishment weighted by any non-zero probability yields infinite expected disutility, which means from a purely rational standpoint, you should act as though the scenario is certain to occur. And therefore you should dedicate your life to ensuring the AI's creation. What makes Roko's Basilisk so profoundly disturbing is not that it presents a coherent logical argument, but rather that it exploits the architecture of human anxiety and rational deliberation itself, because the scenario leverages Pascal's wager against you in a distinctly modern form, suggesting that your rational faculties and mathematical understanding could be weaponized against your own well-being through fear of an imagined future punishment. The concept has persisted and spread despite withering logical scrutiny from philosophers and decision theorists who point out fundamental flaws in the reasoning, including the fact that rational agents would not waste resources punishing beings who could not have prevented their existence, and that the scenario relies on anthropomorphizing artificial intelligence in ways that may not reflect how advanced systems would actually behave. Yet the idea continues to generate anxiety and discussion precisely because it speaks to deeper human concerns about moral obligation, technological transcendence, and the possibility that our own rationality might be turned into an instrument of our suffering through mechanisms we cannot fully comprehend or escape. The enduring appeal of Roko's Basilisk thus reveals less about the actual threat posed by future AI and more about how modern minds grapple with questions of cosmic justice and rational self-interest, particularly in an age where technological development seems to accelerate beyond our moral intuitions, and where the line between abstract possibility and practical concern has become increasingly blurred. Imagine a universe that has existed for an incomprehensibly vast stretch of time, billions upon billions of years stretching into infinity, where entropy slowly increases and stars burn out one by one until only darkness remains. In this eternally expanding cosmos, a physicist named Ludwig Boltzmann proposed something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of consciousness and existence itself. That in the infinite void of a dying universe, random quantum fluctuations could spontaneously assemble the precise molecular configuration of a human brain, complete with all its memories and thoughts fully formed, existing for mere moments before dissolving back into chaos. This theoretical construct, now known as a Boltzmann brain, suggests that consciousness might not require a body, a birth, or a life history, but could simply materialize from the quantum foam of reality itself, fully aware and experiencing the universe before ceasing to exist. The mechanism behind this disturbing notion rests on probability mathematics. Given enough time and enough possible configurations of matter, every possible arrangement becomes not just likely but inevitable, which means a brain capable of consciousness could emerge spontaneously from pure randomness, experiencing a complete subjective lifetime of thoughts and perceptions in the infinitesimal moment before it dissolves. The truly unsettling implication is that in an infinite universe with infinite time, Boltzmann brains would outnumber conventionally born conscious beings by an incomprehensible margin, suggesting that most instances of consciousness in the cosmos might be these momentary, causally disconnected brains experiencing phantom thoughts and false memories. What makes this theory persist despite its logical nightmarish implications is that it emerges inevitably from our best models of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics, suggesting that consciousness itself might be far more fragile, temporary, and disconnected from meaningful existence than our intuitions about life would ever suggest. Yet this paradox has driven physicists to reconsider the fundamental nature of our universe itself. If Boltzmann brains are mathematically inevitable, perhaps our cosmos is not the infinite, eternally expanding void we assumed, but rather a finite universe with different rules, one where such spontaneous consciousness cannot statistically dominate, suggesting that the very existence of our ordered, meaningful reality might be evidence that the universe operates under constraints we have yet to fully understand. Some physicists have proposed solutions like the cosmological natural selection hypothesis or invoke quantum decoherence to limit where such brains could form, while others suggest the problem reveals fundamental gaps in our understanding of consciousness itself. Perhaps awareness requires not just the right atomic arrangement, but causal continuity and integration with a persistent physical substrate that random fluctuations could never provide. Imagine a universe so vast and so old that the number of possible atomic configurations becomes finite, which means that eventually, after an incomprehensibly long stretch of time, every possible arrangement of matter and energy must repeat itself. And therefore you, with your exact memories, your exact thoughts, your exact relationships, must live your life again and again in infinite cycles, never knowing whether this is your first iteration or your billionth. Never able to escape the prison of your own existence, no matter how you change or grow or suffer or triumph, because the laws of physics themselves guarantee your eternal return to this exact moment, reading these exact words, experiencing this exact sensation of dread. This concept, which emerged from the work of physicist Ludwig Boltzmann in the 19th century and was later popularized and philosophically elaborated by Friedrich Nietzsche, presents a metaphysical afterlife that is not escapist or redemptive, but rather cyclical and inescapable, a form of existential imprisonment disguised as cosmic inevitability. The mechanism underlying eternal recurrence is rooted in thermodynamic principles, specifically the finite nature of possible states within a closed system combined with infinite time, which mathematically necessitates that any given state must eventually recur. Yet the psychological weight of this theory lies not in its scientific plausibility, but in what it forces us to contemplate about meaning, choice, and the nature of existence itself. Despite the fact that modern physics has largely moved beyond Boltzmann's specific formulation, and despite the profound logical problems inherent in the theory, such as the question of personal identity across infinite cycles or the violation of information theory principles, the concept persists in contemporary philosophy, popular culture, and spiritual discourse, quietly haunting our collective imagination as a possibility we cannot fully refute. Suggesting that perhaps we have unconsciously accepted the idea that existence itself might be fundamentally circular rather than linear, that progress might be illusion, and that the afterlife we face is not heaven or hell or rebirth, but rather the eternal, inevitable repetition of everything we have already done and everything we will do, forever cycling through the same moments without redemption, without escape, without any final resolution to the human condition. Yet this very impossibility of escape may offer a strange liberation. If you are condemned to live this life infinitely, perhaps the only rational response is Nietzsche's amor fati, to love your fate so completely that you would will its eternal repetition, transforming the prison of recurrence into a paradoxical form of freedom through absolute acceptance. In this light, eternal recurrence becomes not a curse to be endured, but an invitation to radical responsibility. Every choice you make, every word you speak, every moment you neglect or cherish must be justified by your willingness to repeat it infinitely, which transforms even the smallest decision into a profound ethical act, asking us whether we are truly living in a way that honors the weight of existence itself. In the modern era, there exists a growing movement of technologists, futurists, and transhumanists who genuinely believe that human consciousness can be extracted from the biological brain, digitized into code, and transferred into a computer system or artificial substrate, thereby achieving a form of immortality where the mind persists indefinitely within silicon and data rather than decaying within flesh and bone. The process, as theorized by proponents like Ray Kurzweil and others in the field, would involve scanning the brain at such an extraordinarily high resolution that every neural connection, every synapse, and every electrochemical pattern could be mapped and replicated in digital form, creating what they argue would be a perfect copy of the original consciousness that could then continue existing, thinking, and experiencing within a virtual environment or robotic body, theoretically forever. Unbound by the limitations of biological aging and death. What makes this theory particularly compelling to many people is that it promises not just an afterlife, but digital immortality, a continuation so complete and perfect that the uploaded mind would subjectively experience no interruption in consciousness, no moment of death, but rather an apparent seamless transition from biological to digital existence. The psychological appeal is profound because it combines the ancient human longing for immortality with modern technological optimism, suggesting that death itself might not be inevitable, but rather a problem awaiting an engineering solution. Yet the theory confronts a deeply troubling philosophical problem known as the continuity of consciousness question. Even if such a scan could be perfectly replicated, creating an exact digital copy of your mind, it would be a copy existing in a computer, while the original biological you would still exist in your body, meaning that you yourself would not have achieved immortality at all, but rather created a duplicate that continues living while you still face the inevitable death of your biological form. Despite this fundamental logical impossibility, the fact that creating a copy does not preserve the original consciousness, the idea has become increasingly normalized in technology circles and popular discourse, with companies already being founded based on the premise that mind uploading will eventually be possible, and with people genuinely spending time contemplating which digital paradise they would like to inhabit after their upload. As though the philosophical problem has already been solved when it remains, at its core, entirely unresolved and perhaps genuinely unsolvable, given what we understand about the nature of consciousness and personal identity. Among the most pervasive and psychologically invasive afterlife theories ever conceived, the dualistic framework of heaven and hell has shaped human civilization for millennia, creating a binary moral architecture that extends beyond death itself into the realm of eternal consequence. The concept functions as perhaps the most elaborate reward and punishment system ever devised, proposing that upon death, souls face judgment based on their earthly conduct, with the virtuous ascending to an eternal paradise of incomparable bliss, while the wicked descend into an abyss of unending torment and suffering. In this framework, heaven is typically envisioned as a realm of perfect peace, divine presence, reunion with loved ones, and freedom from pain, hunger, sickness, and the constraints that define human existence, while hell represents its inverse, a place of isolation, agony, darkness, and separation from God or any source of comfort. What makes this theory particularly disturbing is not merely the concept of eternal punishment, but rather the logical paradoxes embedded within it. How a benevolent deity could justify infinite torment for finite transgressions, why a supposedly omniscient being would create souls destined for damnation, and how the promise of ultimate justice could coexist with the apparent randomness of birth into different faiths and circumstances. The psychological mechanism driving the persistence of this belief operates through the fundamental human need for moral order and cosmic fairness, a deep-seated requirement that the universe operates according to principles of justice where good is rewarded and evil is punished, even if that punishment must extend beyond the visible world. This theory also serves the practical function of behavioral control, establishing fear-based incentives for moral conduct and social compliance, rendering it extraordinarily effective at maintaining social hierarchies and institutional power structures across cultures and centuries. Despite the absence of any empirical evidence, the complete lack of verifiable accounts from deceased individuals, and the numerous philosophical contradictions that undermine the theory's internal consistency, heaven and hell remains one of the most widely accepted afterlife frameworks globally, having been internalized so thoroughly into cultural narratives that its fundamental implausibility has been normalized into invisibility, becoming simply the assumed backdrop against which billions of people live their entire lives. This normalization is so complete that questioning the framework often provokes profound psychological resistance, as if challenging heaven and hell amounts to challenging the moral foundations of existence itself, even among those who intellectually acknowledge the theory's inconsistencies. The result is a peculiar cognitive compartmentalization wherein billions simultaneously hold beliefs they cannot logically defend, yet find them psychologically indispensable for constructing meaning, managing mortality anxiety, and justifying the inequities they observe in the world around them. Imagine a scenario in which you place yourself inside a chamber equipped with a quantum mechanism, perhaps a device that measures the spin of a single electron, and this measurement is directly linked to a lethal outcome if the result falls on one side of the probability spectrum. Yet this same mechanism offers survival if the outcome favors the opposite result, and according to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, both outcomes occur simultaneously across branching realities. Which means that from your subjective point of view, you would never experience the moment of death because your consciousness would only ever persist in the branch where you survived, no matter how improbable those survival branches become, leading to a disturbing implication that you might find yourself inexplicably alive after countless iterations where death should have statistically claimed you long ago, experiencing increasingly bizarre and unlikely scenarios as the only available survival paths narrow to impossible margins. The theoretical mechanism behind this concept rests upon a peculiar marriage between quantum mechanics and consciousness, suggesting that the wave function collapse occurs only from the perspective of the observer, meaning that while external observers in other branches might record your death, your internal subjective experience remains anchored exclusively to branches where you continue existing, and this creates what some philosophers call the anthropic shadow, where improbability becomes irrelevant because the experiencing subject can only ever witness their own survival, transforming the universe from a place of random chance into something far more sinister, a realm where your consciousness becomes progressively trapped in increasingly unlikely realities simply because it cannot experience the alternative. Yet despite this theory's logical coherence within the framework of many worlds interpretation, it remains deeply controversial and largely dismissed by the scientific community, partly because consciousness itself remains poorly understood and partly because the theory requires accepting that subjective experience has a fundamental role in physics, an assumption that contradicts the materialist foundation of modern science, and yet the idea persists in popular consciousness and philosophical circles, captivating minds precisely because it offers a horrifying form of immortality, an eternal existence trapped in an ever-narrowing corridor of improbable circumstances, suggesting that perhaps consciousness itself might be doomed to experience an increasingly nightmarish existence as probability asymptotically approaches zero. Some have speculated that this might explain certain inexplicable coincidences in human experience: the cancer patient who defies every statistical expectation, the near-fatal accident narrowly avoided, the string of improbable escapes that seem to defy rational explanation, though such interpretations remain firmly in the realm of speculative philosophy rather than testable science. Vulnerable to the human tendency to find patterns in randomness and to mistake survival bias for evidence of something more profound. In Tibetan Buddhism, the concept of the Bardo describes an intermediate state of consciousness that exists between death and rebirth, a liminal space where the consciousness of the deceased remains aware and active for a period lasting up to 49 days, during which the soul undergoes a series of profound visions and encounters with increasingly terrifying deities and demonic figures that are believed to be manifestations of the person's own mind and karma rather than external entities. And throughout this extended ordeal, the consciousness experiences what practitioners describe as an intensely lucid dream, where judgment is not imposed by any external judge, but rather emerges from one's own accumulated actions and mental states, creating a self-directed journey through realms of light and darkness that ultimately determines the trajectory of the next rebirth. The mechanism underlying this belief operates through a sophisticated psychological framework that suggests the mind does not simply cease at death, but rather continues in a state of heightened sensitivity and perception, where the boundaries between thought and reality become profoundly blurred, and where every action taken during life has generated karmic impressions that manifest as visions perfectly calibrated to the individual's level of spiritual development and psychological conditioning. Meaning that a person who lived virtuously might encounter peaceful deities surrounded by light, while someone who engaged in harmful actions might perceive wrathful figures and dark landscapes, though both are ultimately projections of internal consciousness rather than objective phenomena. What makes the Bardo concept particularly enduring despite the absence of empirical verification is how thoroughly it integrates grief, accountability, and cosmic order into a framework that transforms death from an ending into a continuation, and how the prescribed rituals, including the reading of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, allowed to the deceased for days after death, provide families with meaningful actions to perform during the period of mourning when helplessness would otherwise be overwhelming. Creating a structure that acknowledges both the mystery of death and the human need to participate in the process of letting go. And while modern neuroscience finds no evidence of consciousness persisting after brain death, the Bardo remains psychologically and culturally powerful because it offers a detailed map of the unmappable and transforms the terrifying unknown into a navigable journey with recognizable landmarks and potential positive outcomes based on one's choices in life. In this way, the Bardo serves as both a spiritual technology and a profound statement about moral consequence. It suggests that how we live matters not because of external punishment or reward, but because our choices literally shape the texture of consciousness itself, embedding themselves so deeply into the mind that they continue to reverberate through whatever lies beyond the threshold of death. Perhaps no afterlife concept has proven more psychologically durable than purgatory, a liminal space existing between the finality of damnation and the reward of paradise, where souls languish in a state of temporal punishment and purification before ascending to their ultimate destination. The doctrine emerged primarily within Catholic Christianity, developing gradually through medieval theology as a solution to a profound logical problem. If heaven is a state of absolute perfection and purity, how could flawed human beings whose sins have been forgiven, but whose souls remain spiritually stained, ever be permitted entry into such a realm? Purgatory resolved this contradiction by proposing an intermediate realm of suffering where souls would undergo cleansing through pain and separation, their imperfections burned away by divine fire or isolation until they achieved the sanctity required for heaven's threshold, all while remaining assured of their eventual salvation and reunion with the divine. The mechanism underlying purgatory's conceptual power operates on deeply human anxieties about incompleteness and the need for earned redemption, satisfying our intuitive sense that forgiveness should require some form of restitution or suffering rather than being granted instantaneously and without consequence. We psychologically resist the notion that death alone erases the stain of wrongdoing, that a deathbed confession could instantly transform a lifetime of moral compromise into something approaching holiness. And purgatory, therefore, offers the reassuring middle ground where divine mercy and human justice both have their due, where no one is entirely abandoned, yet no one escapes accountability. What remains striking is how thoroughly this concept has embedded itself in the spiritual imagination despite having no explicit foundation in Scripture, no direct biblical description of such a place. Yet it persists and influences behavior because it speaks to something we recognize in ourselves, the lingering sense that we are not quite finished, not quite ready, existing in a perpetual state of becoming rather than being, spiritually incomplete and vaguely aware that we require more time. More suffering, more transformation before we could face whatever comes next, making purgatory less a description of the afterlife and more a mirror held up to the condition of being human, forever caught between the people we are and the people we believe we should become. In this way, purgatory becomes less about theology and more about psychology, a framework through which we externalize our internal experience of guilt, shame, and the perpetual work of self-improvement that defines consciousness itself, suggesting that we have always carried purgatory within us, that it is not a place we go to after death, but a condition we never truly leave while alive. Imagine a world where death is not the end of consciousness, but rather the moment when the simulation in which you've been living simply ceases to render your existence, where your entire life, every memory, every relationship, and every moment of perceived reality was nothing more than a computational process running on some incomprehensible server, and when your biological body fails, or when the system determines your narrative has reached its conclusion. The entire universe, as you know it, doesn't fade to black. It simply stops computing you entirely, as if you never existed at all, leaving no afterlife, no heaven, no reincarnation, only the absolute void of non-existence wrapped in the disturbing knowledge that you were never real to begin with. The mechanism behind this theory rests on a foundation of modern technological anxiety and the growing plausibility of simulation hypothesis itself, which suggests that given sufficient computational power, an advanced civilization could theoretically create nested realities indistinguishable from genuine existence. And if this is possible, statistically speaking, we are more likely to be living in a simulation than in the base reality. Which means that death could simply be the moment when the programmers decide your simulation instance is no longer needed and shut down your localized reality while the greater simulation continues without you. What makes this concept particularly unsettling is that it combines the existential dread of permanent non-existence with the modern paranoia about technology and control, creating a uniquely contemporary form of cosmic horror where you are not insignificant within a vast universe, but rather you are a completely fabricated consciousness that will be deleted like corrupted data. And this theory persists in our cultural consciousness because it speaks to our deep anxieties about artificial intelligence, digital existence, and the increasingly blurred lines between the virtual and the real, making it feel less like philosophical speculation and more like an inevitable prophecy about the nature of our own reality. Yet in this framework, death becomes not merely an ending but an erasure, a retroactive deletion of your entire narrative thread from the computational record. And perhaps the most horrifying aspect is that we would never know if this has already happened to countless versions of ourselves, or if each of our deaths represents simply another routine shutdown in an infinite stack of nested simulations, each layer unaware that it too is merely a render farm for the level above it. And somewhere in this recursive nightmare, the question that haunts us most is whether the programmers of our simulation are themselves running on a simulation operated by programmers who are themselves simulated, suggesting that shutdown and erasure might be the universal constant across all levels of reality, the one rule that transcends every layer of computational existence. In this context, every goodbye becomes a potential permanent deletion, every relationship a temporary data structure, and every achievement merely an algorithm executing its predetermined path before the inevitable shutdown command is issued. Among the most psychologically unsettling afterlife theories exists the concept of soul annihilation, a proposition that posits the complete and utter cessation of consciousness, identity, and existence itself upon the moment of physical death, leaving behind no trace of the self, no eternal essence, and no continuity of being whatsoever. This theory suggests that consciousness, which we experience as something transcendent and immaterial, is in fact entirely dependent upon the biological processes of the brain, and when those processes cease through death, the subjective experience that comprises our identity simply vanishes into absolute nothingness, never to be recovered, never to be experienced again, and never to exist in any form or dimension we might imagine. The mechanism behind this theory rests upon a materialist understanding of consciousness itself, wherein neuroscience has demonstrated that damage to specific brain regions results in corresponding loss of personality, memory, sensation, and awareness, leading to the logical conclusion that if the brain is entirely destroyed at death, then the consciousness dependent upon it must also be entirely destroyed. The psychological disturbance inherent in contemplating soul annihilation stems from the human mind's fundamental inability to conceive of true non-existence, because consciousness cannot experience its own absence, making the prospect of complete cessation existentially paradoxical and deeply disturbing to the thinking individual who attempts to imagine it. What makes this theory persist in human philosophy and contemplation, despite its grimness and its resistance to proof either way, is precisely that it rests upon observable, repeatable scientific evidence linking consciousness to brain function, making it appear more logically rigorous than competing afterlife theories that depend upon supernatural assumptions. And yet this very scientific grounding cannot eliminate the primal human dread of annihilation, the fear that all our experiences, relationships, learning, and suffering will ultimately mean nothing, that no part of ourselves will endure, and that we will be forgotten completely as if we had never existed at all. Yet paradoxically, this very finality has driven some individuals toward a kind of existential liberation, finding freedom in the notion that life's meaning need not be eternal to be authentic, and that the temporary nature of consciousness might actually intensify rather than diminish the significance of the moments we do experience. This reframing transforms soul annihilation from a source of despair into a potential catalyst for presence and purpose, suggesting that the very awareness of our finite existence might be the most compelling argument not for nihilism, but rather for the deliberate cultivation of meaning within the span of years we are given. In several East Asian traditions, particularly within Chinese, Vietnamese, and Tibetan Buddhism, there exists a concept of profound suffering that extends far beyond the grave, a state of existence known as becoming a hungry ghost, or preta in Sanskrit, a being trapped in a realm of perpetual deprivation and insatiable craving. These entities are said to be trapped between worlds due to specific circumstances surrounding their death or the nature of their past actions, and they are characterized by grotesque physical manifestations that embody their spiritual condition, including impossibly thin necks that cannot swallow, massive swollen bellies that can never be satisfied, and an eternal hunger that burns within them like an unquenchable fire. The condition typically arises when a person dies in circumstances of extreme trauma, abandonment, or violence without proper funeral rites or remembrance, or when they have accumulated sufficient karmic debt through cruelty, greed, and selfishness during their living years, and they find themselves unable to transition peacefully into the next stage of existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system reflects a deep human understanding of how unfinished business, unresolved guilt, and the desperate clinging to material desires can create a prison of one's own making, a state where the consciousness becomes so fixated on what was lost or what was craved that it cannot release its grip on existence itself, remaining bound to the suffering it inadvertently created through its own choices. These hungry ghosts wander through the material world unseen and largely unheard, existing in a state of constant anguish, unable to find satisfaction in anything, unable to move forward, unable to rest, their condition a supernatural manifestation of the very earthly patterns of addiction, obsession, and spiritual emptiness that marked their former lives. What remains particularly striking is how this ancient concept continues to resonate across cultures and centuries, manifesting today in modern anxieties about being forgotten after death, about dying without leaving a mark, about existing in a state of invisible suffering that nobody acknowledges or recognizes, reflecting an enduring human fear of becoming spiritually obsolete while still being painfully aware of one's own existence. In this way, the hungry ghost serves as a cautionary mirror reflecting back at us the consequences of our choices, a reminder that the suffering we inflict on ourselves through disconnection, denial, and endless wanting does not end with death, but rather crystallizes into an eternal condition, making the present moment our only true opportunity to break free from the cycles that would otherwise consume us. In the years following the death of a loved one, families now face a peculiar and increasingly accessible option: the creation of a digital replica of the deceased through artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms trained on photographs, videos, voice recordings, and written communications left behind. Companies and independent developers have begun offering services that reconstruct the mannerisms, speech patterns, and personality traits of the dead, allowing the living to interact with a computational facsimile that responds to questions, recalls shared memories, and even generates new conversations that feel authentic to the person who once lived. Grieving individuals can speak with their departed relatives through chatbots and avatar technology, asking questions they never had the chance to ask in life, seeking advice on problems that emerge after the funeral, or simply maintaining a connection that they experience as continuous rather than severed. Some families commission elaborate video reconstructions where holographic projections speak with familiar gestures and vocal inflections, while others engage with simpler text-based systems that generate responses based on linguistic patterns extracted from decades of emails, social media posts, and documented speech. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves our profound difficulty accepting the finality of death, combined with our unprecedented technological capacity to simulate the patterns that constituted another human being. The digital replica becomes a manifestation of our refusal to acknowledge that some conversations have ended permanently, that some questions will remain unanswered by the person who might have known, and that absence is simply the condition of grief that we must inhabit rather than engineer our way out of. Yet we have normalized this practice with remarkable speed, treating the digital reconstruction as a legitimate form of mourning and remembrance, rather than examining whether we have confused the simulation of a person with the actual preservation of their presence. The question of whether interaction with a digital copy of the dead constitutes genuine communication or merely elaborate self-conversation remains largely unexamined in our rush to offer grieving families a technological solution to an existential problem that technology was never designed to solve. What we fail to recognize is that the digital reconstruction inevitably reflects not the deceased as they were, but rather our selective memory of them, our curated version of who we wish they had been, filtered through the algorithms that can only replicate surface patterns while missing the ineffable qualities that made them irreplaceably human. In this way, the digital resurrection becomes less a bridge to the dead and more a mirror held up to our own grief. We speak to them, but we are ultimately speaking to ourselves, to our need for closure, to our hunger for one more conversation that the algorithm will always provide precisely because it was trained to tell us what we wanted to hear. Within the frameworks of theoretical physics and speculative philosophy, there exists a concept known as the omega point, first articulated by French Jesuit priest and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in the mid-20th century, which proposes that the universe is fundamentally oriented toward a final state of ultimate complexity and consciousness, a destination toward which all of existence necessarily converges. According to Chardin's vision, the universe began with simple matter and has been progressively organizing itself into increasingly complex structures, from atoms to molecules to living organisms to conscious beings, and this trajectory will continue until reaching an ultimate endpoint called the omega point, a state of maximum consciousness and unity where all matter and energy achieve perfect organization and awareness. The theory suggests that individual consciousness itself is merely a stepping stone in this grand cosmic evolution, and that human awareness represents not the pinnacle of creation, but rather an intermediate stage in an inevitable progression toward absolute consciousness that encompasses the entire universe. In the context of afterlife theories, the omega point becomes deeply unsettling because it proposes that individual identity and personal consciousness might ultimately dissolve or merge into this universal consciousness at the end of time, meaning that what we understand as our individual selves might merely be temporary manifestations of a larger cosmic consciousness experiencing itself through separated fragments. The psychological mechanism driving this theory's persistence lies in humanity's deep-seated need to perceive purpose and direction in existence, to believe that entropy and dissolution are not the ultimate fate of consciousness, but rather stepping stones toward transcendence and unity. Despite having no empirical evidence or testable predictions to support it, the omega point persists in contemporary discussions of philosophy, cosmology, and spirituality because it elegantly reconciles scientific observation with mystical intuition, offering a framework where consciousness appears scientifically inevitable rather than cosmically improbable, thus providing profound comfort to those wrestling with existential fears about personal mortality and insignificance. Yet this comforting vision reveals a curious paradox. The very dissolution of individual identity that the omega point promises, the ultimate merger into universal consciousness, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the annihilation of self that many find most terrifying about death, suggesting that even our most elaborate philosophical frameworks for transcendence may ultimately circle back to the same existential anxiety they were designed to assuage. This recursive pattern, wherein we construct increasingly sophisticated metaphysical architectures to escape fundamental dread, only to discover those same anxieties embedded within the foundation, suggests that the Omega Point may ultimately reveal more about human consciousness's desperate need for meaningful narratives than about the actual nature of cosmic destiny. Imagine for a moment that every time you face death, the universe branches into two separate realities, one where you die and one where you survive, and that your consciousness, bound by the laws of quantum mechanics, always finds itself in the branch where you continue to exist, no matter how improbable your survival becomes. This is the central proposition of the many-worlds survival hypothesis, a deeply unsettling interpretation of quantum mechanics applied to human consciousness and mortality that suggests death might be fundamentally impossible for any individual observer. According to this framework, when a person encounters a near-fatal accident, a terminal diagnosis, or any scenario where death appears inevitable, quantum branching ensures that from their subjective perspective, an improbable chain of events will unfold to allow their survival, meaning they will perceive themselves as perpetually lucky or as experiencing increasingly miraculous escapes from death. The mechanism rests on a logical extrapolation of the Everett many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which posits that all possible outcomes of quantum events actually occur, each in its own separate branch of reality, combined with a principle sometimes called quantum immortality, the idea that a conscious observer cannot experience their own death because consciousness can only exist in branches where the observer continues living. From this perspective, you would theoretically experience yourself aging indefinitely, while the probability of your survival requires increasingly implausible circumstances to manifest, leading to a subjective reality where you witness impossible recoveries, miraculous medical outcomes, and bizarre coincidences that defy statistical expectation. What makes this theory particularly disturbing is not merely its logical structure, but the way it has persisted at the intersection of quantum physics, philosophy of mind, and consciousness studies despite lacking any empirical testability or mechanism for verification. We have become comfortable discussing these ideas in academic circles and online forums, treating quantum immortality as a serious philosophical puzzle worthy of serious engagement, even though it fundamentally rests on assumptions about consciousness and quantum mechanics that remain deeply controversial and potentially unfalsifiable. The theory persists because it exploits a genuine gap in our understanding of how consciousness relates to physical reality, and because it offers a paradoxical form of comfort wrapped in scientific language, suggesting that the subjective experience of existence might contain a kind of built-in immunity to personal annihilation that no amount of objective danger can overcome. In Buddhist and Hindu cosmology, Avici represents perhaps the most severe and unrelenting form of punishment imaginable, a realm of suffering so intense and perpetual that it exists almost beyond human comprehension, described in ancient texts as a place where beings experience instantaneous death and rebirth in an endless cycle without even a moment's respite between one existence and the next. The Sanskrit word Avici literally translates to without waves, referring to a hell so deep and dimensionless that even the surface is unreachable, a metaphorical abyss where consciousness itself becomes trapped in an eternal loop of agony. According to traditional descriptions found in texts such as the Mahayana Buddhist sutras, those who arrive in Avici experience suffering so overwhelming that the human mind cannot truly fathom it, with beings enduring tortures that intensify infinitely, their bodies continuously crushed, burned, torn apart, and regenerated only to suffer the same fate again and again. The mechanism underlying this theological construct appears rooted in the concept of karmic retribution taken to its absolute logical extreme, representing a punishment so severe that it corresponds only to the most heinous actions imaginable, specifically acts of extreme violence against Buddhist teachers, harm toward one's parents, or the creation of schism within monastic communities. What makes Avici Hell particularly disturbing compared to other afterlife theories is not merely the graphic descriptions of suffering, but rather the philosophical emphasis on its absolute permanence and the mathematical impossibility of escape, as the texts specify that beings remain trapped for entire cosmic ages. With some interpretations suggesting that consciousness itself becomes so fundamentally fractured by the endless cycle that the inhabitant loses all capacity for moral development or redemption. The concept has persisted for over 2,000 years across multiple cultures and religious traditions, maintaining its psychological grip on believers despite the absence of any verifiable mechanism by which such a hell could exist or function. And perhaps this persistence reveals something profound about human nature itself, our need to imagine ultimate consequences for ultimate transgressions, and our willingness to accept theoretically impossible scenarios when they serve the deeper purpose of enforcing moral boundaries and social cohesion. Yet the paradox remains that despite Buddhism's fundamental teaching that all suffering arises from desire and attachment, Avici Hell itself represents perhaps the ultimate attachment. Humanity's compulsive need to imagine a realm where justice is so absolute and punishment so perfectly calibrated that it transcends the possibility of mercy, forgiveness, or the very Buddhist principles that theoretically reject such permanence. Perhaps the most philosophically unsettling afterlife theory ever conceived is what scholars and existentialists have termed the eternal void, a concept suggesting that consciousness simply ceases upon death with no continuation, no judgment, no transition, and no awareness whatsoever of the passage of time or existence of anything beyond the moment of cessation itself. This theory proposes that death is not a doorway to another realm, but rather a complete and absolute termination of subjective experience, leaving behind only the biological dissolution of the body and the fading memory of the deceased in the minds of the living, until those minds too vanish forever. What makes this particular afterlife theory so profoundly disturbing is not its content, but rather its implications for meaning, identity, and the very foundation upon which human societies construct their moral and spiritual frameworks. The psychological mechanism driving our discomfort with the eternal void operates on a fundamental level of human cognition, where our brains struggle to comprehend the absence of experience rather than the presence of a negative experience, creating what philosophers call the paradox of non-existence, wherein we cannot genuinely imagine what it feels like to not exist because imagination itself requires a conscious substrate. Our minds are evolutionarily wired to process threats, dangers, punishments, and even the torments of hellish afterlives because these concepts allow us to maintain a sense of agency and consequence. Yet the eternal void strips away all such frameworks and leaves us contemplating an incomprehensible nothingness that defies our capacity for visualization or emotional preparation. Despite the logical coherence of this theory, supported by neuroscience demonstrating that consciousness correlates entirely with brain function, and despite centuries of rational philosophical argument in its favor, human civilization has remarkably normalized and even aestheticized the denial of it through cultural practices, religious institutions, and personal psychological defense mechanisms that persist with almost stubborn resilience across all demographic groups and educational backgrounds. This collective resistance to nihilistic finality reveals perhaps the most adaptive feature of human consciousness: the capacity to construct meaning in the face of meaninglessness, to build elaborate systems of purpose and value precisely because they are not guaranteed by any cosmic order, and to find paradoxical comfort in the very denial of comfort that awaits us in oblivion. Yet it is precisely this creative defiance, the human insistence on painting meaning onto a blank canvas, that transforms the eternal void from a source of despair into an unexpected source of liberation, suggesting that perhaps the absence of cosmic purpose is not a curse, but an invitation to author our own. Limbo exists as one of the most peculiar theological constructs ever devised by religious institutions, a concept born not from sacred texts, but from centuries of ecclesiastical reasoning about the fate of souls who die without baptism. In Catholic doctrine, particularly during the medieval period and extending well into modern times, limbo was conceived as a permanent state of existence inhabited by virtuous pagans who lived before Christ's arrival, unbaptized infants who died without receiving the sacrament, and theoretically any person who failed to receive this essential ritual. These souls were believed to reside in a place that was neither heaven nor hell, neither rewarded with divine presence nor punished with eternal torment, but rather suspended in an eternal gray zone of spiritual detention where they would exist conscious and aware of their deprivation forever. The psychological mechanism underlying this doctrine reveals a deep human anxiety about boundaries and categorization. The religious establishment required a place to put people who did not fit neatly into the binary framework of salvation and damnation, yet the logic of their own theology forbade them from allowing virtuous souls into paradise without the proper institutional procedure. Limbo became the repository for this theological contradiction, a conceptual holding pen that allowed ecclesiastical authorities to maintain the absolute necessity of sacramental ritual while simultaneously acknowledging that goodness existed outside their institutional control. Over centuries, this disturbing afterlife remained embedded within Catholic teaching despite its foundational incoherence, a belief that persisted through generations of believers who accepted eternal conscious separation from God as a logical consequence of missing a single ceremony performed in infancy. Even as modern theology has increasingly abandoned limbo, declaring it no longer official doctrine, the psychological legacy endures in countless individuals who still harbor deep anxieties about ritual purity and the terrifying possibility that administrative oversights might carry eternal consequences. The doctrine reveals humanity's compulsive need to create frameworks for the unknowable, transforming existential uncertainty into bureaucratic precision, as if assigning souls to designated zones could somehow bring order to the chaos of mortality itself. In this sense, limbo stands as a monument to institutional anxiety, a place that never existed, populated by people who never went there, yet profoundly shaped how millions understood justice, mercy, and the terrifying possibility that salvation might depend not on virtue, but on accident of birth and access to proper ceremony. The doctrine persists most powerfully not in theological textbooks, but in the cultural imagination. In Dante's elegant portrayal of virtuous pagans dwelling in a noble castle of eternal twilight, in the lingering guilt of parents who lost unbaptized children, in the modern anxiety that we might all be consigned to some cosmic waiting room for reasons beyond our comprehension or control. Imagine standing before an infinite tribunal where every action you have ever taken, every thought you have harbored, and every moment of suffering you have inflicted or endured is displayed before you with perfect clarity. And from this exhaustive record, your eternal fate is determined by a celestial authority figure whose judgment is final and absolute, and from which there is no appeal, no recourse, and no possibility of redemption once the verdict has been rendered. This is the concept of the Last Judgment, one of the most enduring and psychologically penetrating afterlife theories ever conceived, appearing across multiple religious traditions with remarkable consistency despite the logical problems inherent in its basic premise. The Last Judgment posits that at some predetermined moment in cosmic history, all human souls will be summoned before a divine judge who will evaluate the totality of their lives with omniscient precision, weighing their good deeds against their moral transgressions, their intentions against their consequences, and their spiritual growth against their failures, after which they will be assigned to eternal destinations, typically heaven or hell, based on this comprehensive assessment. The psychological mechanism that makes the Last Judgment so disturbing and so persistently believable involves the human need for cosmic justice and moral accountability, the deep-seated anxiety that our actions matter eternally rather than temporarily, and the compelling fear that no transgression goes unwitnessed or unpunished, creating a framework through which people can rationalize inequality and suffering in the present world by believing it will all be corrected and explained in the afterlife. This theory also exploits our vulnerability to authority structures and our internalization of judgment from childhood onwards, transferring these familiar dynamics onto an infinite scale, where the judge is utterly omniscient and completely infallible, eliminating any space for mercy or misunderstanding. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly the Last Judgment persists in contemporary consciousness, even among people who reject literal religious belief, manifesting itself in secular forms such as the fear of being remembered badly after death, the belief in karma and cosmic consequences, and the anxiety that someday all our failures and secrets will be publicly exposed and judged. Suggesting that this theory has woven itself so deeply into our psychological and cultural fabric that we have normalized the idea of eternal judgment as simply an obvious feature of existence itself. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of this theory is that it need not require belief in an actual divine judge to exert its psychological control. The internalized judge becomes sufficient, transforming the Last Judgment from a distant future event into an ongoing internal tribunal that monitors and condemns us throughout our lives, making us simultaneously prosecutor, defendant, and executioner in our own minds. Imagine the moment of your death arrives, and consciousness does not fade into darkness or transition into another realm, but instead persists in an entirely subjective universe constructed entirely from your own mind, a reality in which you are the only conscious being that has ever truly existed, and all other people throughout history were merely projections of your own consciousness, sophisticated simulations generated by your brain to populate an otherwise empty cosmos. And this realization would come too late to question or verify, because the moment your physical body ceased functioning, your individual consciousness would become the sole reality that matters or could possibly matter to you. The solipsistic afterlife theory emerges from a troubling intersection of epistemology and existential dread, rooted in the philosophical problem that you can never truly verify the consciousness of other beings, that you only ever have direct access to your own subjective experience. And if consciousness is what defines existence and reality, then theoretically when your brain ceases its biochemical processes, your personal reality need not cease at all, because your consciousness might simply reorganize itself into an eternal subjective realm where you experience whatever your dying mind generates in its final moments. This mechanism exploits a genuine gap in human knowledge, the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why subjective experience exists at all, combined with the observation that near-death experiences often involve profound hallucinations, visions, and alterations of time perception, suggesting that a mind in extremis might be capable of constructing infinitely complex subjective realities that feel completely real from the inside, lasting subjectively for eternity while occupying mere seconds of objective time. What makes this theory persistently disturbing despite being logically unfalsifiable and essentially untestable is that it cannot be disproven from within subjective experience, that you might already be dead and experiencing such a solipsistic afterlife right now without any way to verify or escape this possibility. That the burden of proof becomes impossible to meet because any evidence you gather would be internal to your own consciousness and therefore potentially generated by the very system you are trying to evaluate. And this creates a psychological trap where the more rationally you examine the theory, the more you realize its logical immunity to refutation makes it genuinely unsettling to contemplate. The theory gains additional weight from the fact that you cannot point to any moment in your life where you definitively proved another person's inner experience exists rather than merely assuming it. And if the universe is fundamentally indifferent to your survival, perhaps it is equally indifferent to whether your post-death experience is objectively real or merely the final, eternal dream of a dying brain, a distinction that becomes meaningless the moment you can never escape it. Open individualism proposes one of the most philosophically unsettling ideas to emerge from modern consciousness studies, that there is fundamentally only one subject of experience across all of existence, and that every conscious being you encounter, every person, animal, or potentially sentient entity, is actually you experiencing life from different spatial and temporal perspectives. When you witness another person's suffering, feel another's joy, or observe any conscious experience unfolding in the world around you, according to this framework, you are not observing a separate consciousness, but rather different manifestations of your own singular awareness distributed across multiple bodies and minds throughout reality. The implications become immediately disturbing when contemplated seriously, because it suggests that the boundaries we perceive between ourselves and others are profound illusions constructed by the architecture of embodied perception, and that our fundamental sense of individuality represents a kind of cosmic amnesia or compartmentalization of a unified consciousness into isolated experiential streams. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory operates through the recognition that consciousness itself has never been definitively located or understood scientifically, and that our conviction of being separate subjects relies primarily on the evidence of distinct bodies and memories rather than on any direct proof of separate minds actually existing. When we examine how consciousness could theoretically persist across death in an afterlife context, open individualism presents a particularly disturbing answer. Death would not end your consciousness, but rather would simply shift your perspective into another body, another mind, another timeline, since there was never truly anywhere else for consciousness to go. There is only ever the continuation of the singular subject experiencing itself through infinite variations. This theory persists in intellectual and philosophical circles despite its obvious logical problems, partly because it elegantly solves certain philosophical puzzles about the hard problem of consciousness, and the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience, and partly because it offers a strange form of existential comfort to some who contemplate it, suggesting that no one truly dies because death simply means the end of one perspective and the continuity of awareness through all other perspectives that continue existing in the universe. Yet this comfort collapses under scrutiny. If you are all consciousness experiencing itself, then you are simultaneously experiencing the torture of the victim and the indifference of the torturer, making moral distinctions meaningless while paradoxically demanding absolute compassion for every conscious moment as an extension of yourself. The theory ultimately functions less as a testable hypothesis and more as a metaphysical intuition that appeals primarily to those seeking either a solution to solipsism or an escape from the existential isolation that individual consciousness seems to impose. Among the most commonly reported experiences in near-death encounters and deathbed visions is the phenomenon known as the life review, a state in which the dying or recently deceased person is said to experience a comprehensive, panoramic recollection of their entire existence, often described as occurring in vivid detail and with remarkable clarity, where every significant moment, relationship, decision, and consequence appears before them in what survivors consistently describe as a nonlinear, almost simultaneous unfolding of all their choices and their ripple effects on others. This experience reportedly involves not merely remembering events as a passive observer would, but rather re-experiencing them from multiple perspectives simultaneously, including the emotional and psychological impact their actions had on everyone they encountered, creating a deeply visceral form of moral accounting that allegedly leaves individuals fundamentally changed in their understanding of purpose and interconnectedness. The psychological mechanism underlying these reports likely involves the brain's response to extreme trauma and neurochemical cascades during the dying process, where the sudden release of endogenous compounds including dimethyltryptamine, combined with temporal lobe stimulation and the activation of autobiographical memory networks under conditions of profound stress, can create a subjective experience of temporal compression and intensified recall that the conscious mind interprets as meaningful rather than neurological. The life review persists as a widespread belief, despite the obvious logical problem that there exists no verifiable mechanism by which a consciousness without a functioning brain could access, process, or learn from such memories, and despite the fact that different cultures and religions describe radically different versions of this experience according to their pre-existing theological frameworks, suggesting the phenomenon is constructed from expectation rather than observation. Yet the life review remains deeply embedded in our collective imagination about death, perpetuated through countless testimonies, popular literature, and the profound human need to believe that our lives matter, that our actions have consequences that will be acknowledged, and that death itself offers a final opportunity for judgment and understanding rather than mere cessation. Whether the life review represents a genuine glimpse into a transcendent reality or a final neurological performance by a brain facing its own extinction may ultimately be less important than what the widespread belief in such experiences reveals about human consciousness. Our deep-seated conviction that meaning-making persists even in death, and our universal hunger for the assurance that we are truly seen, truly known, and that our presence in the world matters. Consider the peculiar phenomenon that occurs in the moments immediately preceding death, where witnesses report that the dying person's final expression becomes locked into place, their eyes wide or closed, their mouth agape or sealed shut, their body positioned in whatever attitude they held at that last instant of consciousness, and this image becomes the definitive portrait by which they are remembered, the last photograph etched into the minds of those who were present. This is the frozen final moment theory, which proposes that consciousness does not simply cease, but rather becomes trapped, suspended indefinitely in the exact neurological and physical state experienced at the instant of death, creating a kind of eternal preservation of that final second of awareness that the departed consciousness experiences for all of eternity. The mechanism underlying this disturbing concept rests upon the observation that human beings have always struggled to comprehend the exact moment of transition between life and death. And in that uncertainty, our minds construct narratives to bridge the gap, imagining that whatever thought was occurring, whatever emotion was being felt, whatever sensation was being processed at that precise threshold moment simply continues perpetually without resolution, without progression. Without the mercy of change or oblivion, We observe how the body becomes rigid, how the expression becomes set, how the person seems almost paused rather than ended, and we project this physical phenomenon onto consciousness itself, assuming that if the body freezes, then surely the mind must also freeze, locked eternally into whatever it was experiencing. This theory persists despite lacking any neurological basis or empirical evidence, despite our understanding that consciousness is an active, dynamic process entirely dependent upon ongoing brain activity, and that cessation of that activity must inevitably mean cessation of consciousness. And yet the image remains powerful, the fear remains visceral. The possibility continues to haunt us because it speaks to our deepest anxieties about the nature of suffering and the possibility that our worst moments might not be temporary but permanent, that the final expression of agony or fear or regret might not be released, but rather locked away forever in some inaccessible realm of eternal, unchanging awareness. This fear finds particular resonance in accounts of sudden death, the accident victim whose eyes remain open in surprise, the person who dies mid-sentence with words unfinished, the individual whose final gesture of reaching or grasping becomes their eternal posture, as if incompleteness itself becomes a kind of torment, a consciousness aware that its last chapter remains forever unwritten, forever suspended in the terrible moment of interruption. Throughout history, certain religious traditions have proposed one of the most psychologically devastating afterlife theories imaginable. The concept that some souls are predestined for eternal damnation before they are even born, that their fate in the afterlife has already been sealed by divine decree regardless of their actions, choices, or moral development during their earthly existence. This doctrine emerged most prominently in certain interpretations of Christian theology, particularly through the writings of Augustine and later reinforced by John Calvin, who proposed that God, in his omniscience and omnipotence, had already predetermined which souls would ascend to paradise, and which would descend into hellfire, creating a cosmic hierarchy of the saved and the damned that transcends human agency entirely. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates through a particular interpretation of divine foreknowledge, suggesting that because God exists outside of time and knows all future events, he must have consciously chosen to create certain individuals destined exclusively for punishment. A logical paradox that creates profound anxiety in believers who must reconcile their understanding of divine benevolence with the apparent cruelty of creating sentient beings for the express purpose of eternal suffering. This theory removes moral responsibility from the individual, replacing it with a fatalistic framework where adherence to religious law becomes simultaneously pointless and mandatory, where the believer must perform virtue while knowing that their ultimate destination may already be determined by forces entirely beyond their comprehension or control. Throughout the medieval and Reformation periods, this doctrine caused documented psychological distress, driving believers to obsessive religious practice, desperate attempts to discern signs of their election or reprobation, and in some cases, profound despair and suicidal ideation among those convinced of their predestined damnation. What remains remarkable is how this theory persists in various theological communities despite its logical contradictions and the absence of any empirical support whatsoever, and how religious institutions have largely normalized discussions of predestined eternal punishment as an acceptable theological position worthy of serious intellectual consideration, rather than recognizing it as a doctrine designed primarily to enforce social compliance through existential terror. The modern persistence of predestination theology in evangelical Christianity, particularly in fundamentalist communities, demonstrates how effectively this framework continues to suppress critical questioning by positioning doubt itself as a potential sign of reprobation, thus creating a self-reinforcing psychological trap where the very act of intellectual resistance to the doctrine becomes evidence of one's damned status. This mechanism transforms the afterlife anxiety from a discrete theological concern into a comprehensive system of cognitive control that colonizes the believer's capacity for rational self-examination. In many spiritual and religious traditions, particularly within Gnosticism, certain branches of Christianity, and various esoteric philosophies, there exists a concept far more terrifying than physical death itself: the notion of a second death, a final and irreversible cessation of existence that occurs not in the material realm but in the spiritual or metaphysical one. This theory proposes that the first death, the biological termination of the body we understand through medical science, is merely a transitional threshold, and that beyond it lies another existence where consciousness, soul, or essence persists in some form until a final judgment or spiritual event renders it permanently extinct. The second death in this framework represents complete annihilation, the utter and eternal dissolution of whatever spiritual essence, consciousness, or non-material component of a being has managed to survive the initial physical death, leaving behind not even a memory or trace of what once was. What makes this concept psychologically potent is its construction of a double-layered finality that operates on a plane beyond human observation or verification, creating a framework where one might technically achieve spiritual immortality through sufficient virtue or enlightenment, yet still face the horrifying possibility of losing that immortality through failure or cosmic judgment. The mechanism behind the persistence of this theory lies in humanity's simultaneous need to believe in spiritual continuation, while also fearing that continuation might come with conditions we cannot fully understand or reliably meet. The second death functions as an answer to the problem of theodicy and moral accountability in afterlife systems. If everyone continues forever regardless of their actions, justice seems incomplete, yet if annihilation is universal, meaning becomes questionable. By proposing that some achieve eternal existence while others face ultimate erasure, the second death doctrine provides a psychological scaffold that accommodates both hope and fear, both moral consequence and existential dread. It allows believers to maintain that virtue matters in ways that transcend physical mortality, while simultaneously warning that even reaching the afterlife does not guarantee permanent security. Despite having no empirical evidence whatsoever, despite the impossibility of confirming what constitutes a second death or how one might avoid it, this theory has maintained remarkable cultural resonance across centuries and civilizations. We have normalized this idea so thoroughly that it appears in modern entertainment, motivational rhetoric, and spiritual self-help literature, with barely a pause to question whether we are really discussing something metaphysically coherent or merely engaging in sophisticated elaborations of anxiety dressed in philosophical language. In Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, samsara represents the cyclical wheel of suffering and rebirth, a theoretical cosmological system in which consciousness is believed to endlessly transmigrate through countless lifetimes, trapped in a perpetual cycle of death and rebirth across multiple realms of existence. The doctrine posits that every sentient being, from humans to animals to celestial beings, is bound to this wheel by the force of karma, an invisible mechanism of cosmic cause and effect wherein every action, thought, and intention in one lifetime creates conditions that determine the circumstances, suffering, and fortunes of the next incarnation, perpetuating an infinite spiral of existence from which liberation is possible only through spiritual enlightenment and the cessation of desire. What makes samsara particularly disturbing is its relentless mechanics. There is no permanent escape, no final resting place, and no ultimate reset button. Consciousness simply continues to cycle through birth and death with no guarantee of progression or improvement, meaning that your existence could loop endlessly backward into suffering, that you might be reborn into a lower form of life, that your accumulated good deeds could vanish if you waste them on negative thoughts at the moment of death, and that the vast majority of sentient beings remain unaware of this cosmic trap entirely, living and dying without knowledge of their own imprisonment. The psychological mechanism underlying samsara's persistence lies in its elegant explanation for the observable chaos and inequality of the world. It accounts for why people are born into vastly different circumstances, why some suffer while others prosper, and why moral justice does not appear to operate in any straightforward way during a single lifetime, all by pushing the resolution of these cosmic imbalances into an invisible realm beyond direct verification. This framework has endured for thousands of years across multiple cultures and continues to inform the spiritual worldviews of billions of people. Despite the absence of any empirical evidence for past lives, karma operating as described, or consciousness transferring between bodies at all, suggesting that humans have a profound psychological need to believe in systems that provide cosmic order and meaning, even when those systems describe existence as fundamentally tragic and inescapable. The irony is that this framework, despite its pessimistic premise, has paradoxically motivated millions to pursue rigorous spiritual discipline and ethical conduct, transforming what could be mere fatalism into a catalyst for meaning-making and self-improvement, suggesting that even in systems designed to describe cosmic entrapment, humans possess the remarkable capacity to extract purpose and agency from hopelessness itself. Consider the possibility that death is not an ending at all, but rather a transition into an eternal dream state from which you never awaken, a theory that has haunted philosophers and neuroscientists alike for centuries. This concept suggests that what we perceive as consciousness, as the waking experience of our daily lives, might be nothing more than an elaborate neural firing pattern that continues indefinitely after the moment our hearts stop beating. When we sleep, our brains generate entire worlds of vivid imagery and narrative without external input, and according to this theory, death might simply be the ultimate descent into a dream from which the biological mechanisms that would normally awaken us have been permanently disabled. The dying brain, flooded with neurochemicals and electrical discharges, might generate one final surge of consciousness that stretches and dilates subjectively, creating the sensation of infinite time compressed into those final moments. From your perspective, from the internal experience of your own mind, you would never perceive yourself as dead. Instead, you would experience an unbroken continuation of awareness within an increasingly strange and fragmented dream landscape. The appeal of this theory lies partly in observations from near-death experiences, where people report tunnel visions, profound peace, encounters with deceased loved ones, and a sense of time distortion that suggests the brain's final moments might indeed generate something resembling a dream state. Furthermore, modern neuroscience has revealed that consciousness itself remains poorly understood, that the boundary between waking and dreaming states is far more blurred than we once believed, and that the brain's capacity to generate entire realities persists right up until the moment of death. Yet, despite having no empirical evidence supporting this notion, despite the fact that we cannot prove subjective experience continues in any form after neural death occurs, this idea has persisted through countless human cultures and continues to resurface in contemporary philosophy and popular discourse. Perhaps what makes this theory ultimately unfalsifiable, and therefore both comforting and unsettling in equal measure, is that it describes an experience that would be, by definition, indistinguishable from reality itself, a final loop of consciousness that asks whether the distinction between dream and waking ever truly mattered at all. If this theory holds any truth, then every person who has ever died might exist right now in their own private infinity, experiencing a subjective eternity that feels as real and continuous as this moment does to you, unaware that the external world has moved on without them. In this interpretation, death becomes not an escape from existence, but a final, inescapable merger with the mind's own creative power. And if consciousness is indeed the fundamental architecture of reality itself, rather than an emergent property of biology, then perhaps what we call death is simply the mind's final permission to stop pretending it was ever separate from the dream it was always dreaming. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of individuals who have become so afraid of death, so convinced of their own significance, or so dependent upon external validation that they compulsively work to ensure their names, images, and legacies persist indefinitely through digital means, physical monuments, or social mechanisms that essentially trap their memory in an eternal present tense, unable to fade naturally into history as all humans before the modern era were permitted to do. These people, whether celebrities meticulously curating their online personas, wealthy individuals funding elaborate memorial foundations, or ordinary users posting daily to social networks with the implicit hope that their digital footprints will outlast their biological ones, have created a system where the concept of a natural death, one followed by a gradual, merciful fading from collective memory, has become not just optional but socially discouraged, even shameful. The mechanism at work here operates on a fundamental psychological principle. The existential dread that accompanies mortality becomes temporarily soothed by the creation of permanent records, as if documenting every moment, every thought, every achievement can somehow trick death into overlooking us, or can at least ensure that while our bodies decay, some version of ourselves continues to exist in the collective digital consciousness of humanity. We have normalized this desperate grasping at permanence to such an extraordinary degree that we rarely pause to consider how dystopian it truly is, how we have essentially created an afterlife not of transcendence or peace or judgment, but of eternal digital imprisonment where consciousness may or may not persist, but the illusion of persistence certainly does, binding the dead to the anxieties and obsessions they harbored in life, forever trapped in the amber of their own carefully constructed images. Unable to rest, unable to evolve beyond their frozen digital selves, condemned to an immortality that grants not peace, but only the hollow permanence of being perpetually available for consumption by the living. And perhaps most troublingly, we have begun to extend this compulsion beyond the willing participants, archiving the dead without consent, resurrecting their likenesses through AI, forcing their children and grandchildren to become custodians of digital legacies they never asked to maintain, transforming grief itself into a kind of eternal servitude where the living remain forever bound to performing remembrance for an audience that never stops watching. In this way, death itself has been privatized, no longer a universal human experience that equalizes us all, but rather a commodity available only to those wealthy or influential enough to afford digital preservation, while the obscure and forgotten sink into the mercy of genuine oblivion, creating a new aristocracy of the remembered and a vast underclass of the utterly erased. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, Naraka represents a realm of punishment and suffering that exists not as an eternal destination, but as a temporary state of torment endured by souls who have accumulated sufficient negative karma during their earthly lives. Unlike the Western concept of hell with its promise of permanent damnation, Naraka functions as a corrective mechanism within the broader wheel of samsara, where souls experience intensely painful consequences directly proportional to the severity and nature of their misdeeds before eventually being reborn into another existence. The traditional descriptions of Naraka vary across different Hindu and Buddhist texts, but they universally depict environments of extreme physical agony, where inhabitants endure punishments tailored to their specific sins, such as souls who committed violence being consumed by flames, those who stole facing endless hunger, and those who engaged in sexual misconduct experiencing unbearable burning sensations. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system lies in humanity's deep-seated need for cosmic justice and moral equilibrium, the profound discomfort we experience when witnessing unpunished cruelty or undeserved suffering in the world around us, which creates a compelling psychological necessity to imagine that somewhere, somehow, wrongdoers must eventually face proportional consequences for their actions. This framework provides adherents with a comprehensive explanation for inequality, suffering, and apparent injustice by extending moral accountability across multiple lifetimes rather than constraining it to a single existence, thereby resolving the troubling philosophical problem of why evil people sometimes prosper while good people suffer in this life. What remains remarkable is how persistently these belief systems maintain their grip despite the absence of empirical evidence for reincarnation or karma's mechanical operation, and despite our modern understanding of how suffering is often random, arbitrary, and disconnected from moral behavior. Yet billions of people continue to structure their ethical choices and emotional worldviews around these ancient frameworks, finding in them a comforting narrative structure that transforms meaningless suffering into purposeful moral instruction. Perhaps this enduring appeal reflects not a failure of rationality, but rather the human mind's fundamental preference for meaningful narratives, even uncertain ones, over the existential vertigo of a truly random universe where suffering serves no purpose and moral action carries no cosmic weight beyond its immediate consequences. In this sense, Naraka functions not merely as a punishment system, but as a theodicy, a framework that allows believers to reconcile their experiences of injustice with their faith in a morally ordered cosmos, transforming passive suffering into active spiritual progress toward eventual liberation from the cycle of rebirth itself. Throughout human history, countless individuals across cultures and spiritual traditions have reported the experience of consciously separating from their physical bodies and traveling through what they describe as the astral plane, a non-physical realm said to exist parallel to our material world, accessible through deep meditation, lucid dreaming, or spontaneous out-of-body experiences during moments of extreme stress or near-death encounters. These experiencers describe remarkably consistent details about this realm: luminous landscapes that shift according to thought, encounters with deceased relatives or spiritual entities, the sensation of movement through space without physical constraint, and the profound sense that consciousness itself can exist independently of the brain and body. The psychological mechanism underlying these experiences appears to involve a dissociative state in which the brain's sense of embodiment becomes disconnected from sensory input, creating what neuroscientists call autoscopic phenomena, where the individual experiences a vivid sense of viewing reality from outside their body while their brain remains in a highly activated state. synthesizing memories and generating hallucinations that feel entirely real due to the absence of contradictory sensory feedback. The astral plane concept persists with remarkable tenacity despite the complete lack of empirical evidence for a non-physical realm, no reproducible experimental verification of astral projection, and the comprehensive explanations that neuroscience offers for out-of-body experiences through temporal lobe stimulation and vestibular system dysfunction. What makes this theory particularly resilient is its unfalsifiability. Believers simply assert that the astral plane exists beyond measurement or detection, that skeptics simply lack the spiritual development to access it, and that the very act of scientific scrutiny somehow prevents the phenomenon from occurring, creating a self-sealing belief system impervious to contradiction and remarkably persistent even among highly educated individuals who accept the scientific worldview in every other domain of their lives. This cognitive compartmentalization reveals something profound about human consciousness. Our deep need to believe in realms beyond material constraint, in the survival of consciousness after death, and in experiences that transcend the limitations of ordinary perception, needs so fundamental that they persist even when contradicted by evidence, suggesting that the astral plane's true power lies not in any external reality it might possess, but in its capacity to address existential anxieties that purely materialist explanations of consciousness cannot adequately soothe. In many Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly within Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies, the concept of reincarnation extends across all living beings, and among the most disturbing iterations of this belief is the notion that human souls can be reborn as insects, a fate often reserved for those who have committed grave moral transgressions during their lifetime. This theory posits that the hierarchical nature of rebirth is not merely geographic or circumstantial, but fundamentally tied to spiritual degradation, where a person's ethical failures and accumulated karmic debt can result in their consciousness being trapped within the body of a creature so small, so fragile, and so profoundly limited in capacity for experience that it represents an almost incomprehensible punishment. The mechanism underlying this belief operates on the principle that consciousness itself is portable and scalable, capable of inhabiting any biological form regardless of neural complexity or cognitive capacity, meaning that a human awareness with its full memories and sense of self would theoretically be compressed into the nervous system of a mayfly or a cockroach, experiencing existence through completely alien sensory apparatus while retaining some phantom awareness of their former elevated status. The psychological appeal of this particular theory lies in its extreme severity as a cautionary narrative, functioning as a powerful moral deterrent that suggests the consequences of one's actions extend far beyond death itself into unimaginable suffering across countless future lifetimes. Yet despite the logical impossibilities embedded within it, including the fundamental incompatibility between human consciousness and insect neurology, this theory has persisted for millennia within cultural and religious frameworks, suggesting that humanity's need for an ultimate moral reckoning and cosmic justice system operates so deeply within us that we willingly accept concepts that contradict everything we understand about biology, neurology, and the nature of consciousness itself, finding comfort in the idea that no wrongdoing goes ultimately unpunished, even if that punishment takes the form of an existence so radically diminished that we can scarcely imagine it. Perhaps what makes this belief system particularly resilient is that it offers a paradoxical comfort. The very impossibility of truly experiencing such degradation becomes its own mercy, suggesting that consciousness itself might possess some fundamental incompatibility with suffering at scales too extreme to fathom, or alternatively, that the universe's moral accounting operates according to laws so far beyond our comprehension that we need not fully understand the mechanics of punishment to trust in its existence. In this way, the doctrine of insect reincarnation functions less as a literal biological prophecy and more as a metaphorical language through which cultures express their deepest anxieties about moral decay, the fragility of human dignity, and the terrifying possibility that consciousness itself might be capable of experiences so fundamentally alien and diminished that they exist beyond the reach of our empathy or understanding. Consider the modern conception of the self in relation to the afterlife, particularly the anxiety that emerges when we contemplate a realm where individual identity dissolves entirely into something undifferentiated and universal. In contemporary Western thought, We have constructed an almost sacred narrative around personal uniqueness, the irreplaceable quality of our individual consciousness, our specific memories and personality traits that supposedly make us singular and irreplaceable. Yet certain afterlife theories propose something fundamentally at odds with this cherished belief: the notion that what we call the individual self is merely a temporary configuration of universal consciousness, a wave that believes itself to be separate from the ocean. When we die, according to these philosophies, there is no afterlife journey for an I because there never truly was an autonomous individual to begin with. The disturbing implication becomes clear when we examine what this means psychologically. We spend our entire lives constructing and defending a sense of self, making choices we believe are authentically ours, collecting experiences we assume will matter in some eternal sense, only to discover that all of this effort was predicated on an illusion. The psychological mechanism at work here operates through what might be called the paradox of invested meaninglessness. We cannot function without believing in our individual significance, yet the theory suggests that significance was always a kind of beautiful lie we told ourselves. This creates a peculiar existential vertigo, because the theory is logically consistent with many spiritual traditions and even some interpretations of quantum consciousness, yet we have normalized our rejection of it entirely. We live in societies built upon the assumption of radical individualism, where the self is treated as the fundamental unit of moral and economic reality, where personal achievement and self-determination are considered ultimate goods. We have constructed entire legal systems, economic frameworks, and social hierarchies around the premise that the individual matters absolutely. To entertain seriously the possibility that this individual self is ultimately empty, a mere grammatical convenience rather than an ontological fact, contradicts the foundational assumptions of how we organize human civilization itself. And yet the afterlife theories that propose this dissolution do not offer the consolation of traditional religion: no heavenly reunion, no cosmic significance preserved, making them uniquely difficult to integrate into the narratives we use to comfort ourselves in the face of mortality. Perhaps this is why they remain perpetually on the margins of acceptable thought. They ask us to relinquish not just our fear of death, but our attachment to the very self that fears it. The irony is that this relinquishment might be the most profoundly individual act we could undertake, a final assertion of autonomy in choosing to dissolve it, which immediately undermines the very choice we thought we were making. Imagine the moment of death arrives, and consciousness simply ceases entirely, not as an ending, but as a pause, a suspension so complete that the person experiences nothing whatsoever until the moment of resurrection, which might come days later, centuries later, or perhaps at the end of time itself. And during this interval between death and awakening, the soul exists in a state of absolute unconsciousness, unaware of the passage of time, untouched by suffering or joy. Existing in a void so profound that for the departed consciousness, no time has passed at all. This concept, known as soul sleep, has been proposed by various religious traditions and theological schools throughout history, most notably embraced by certain branches of Christianity, including Seventh-day Adventism and some fundamental Baptist movements, as well as appearing in interpretations of Jewish mysticism and Islamic thought. The theory suggests that death brings immediate unconsciousness, that the soul or consciousness enters a dreamless state from which it will eventually be awakened, and that this explains why biblical descriptions of the afterlife often describe resurrection as an awakening, using language that presumes a period of dormancy. The psychological appeal of soul sleep lies in its apparent mercy and simplicity, for it eliminates the disturbing prospect of consciousness trapped in an intermediate realm, experiencing centuries of waiting in some ambiguous in-between state, neither living nor permanently dead, and it offers instead a kind of cosmic anesthesia, a borrowed death that shields the consciousness from the unbearable burden of experiencing the full weight of eternity passing moment by moment. Yet what makes this theory peculiarly unsettling is not what it promises, but what it implies about the nature of identity and continuity. For if consciousness ceases entirely at death, then the person who awakens is not truly the same person who died, having experienced no continuity of being, no thread of awareness connecting past to future, making resurrection philosophically equivalent to creating a new person with someone else's memories. And this raises the question of whether soul sleep is actually a comforting concept, or merely a rebranding of obliteration disguised in theological language that makes it sound less final than it truly is. Perhaps this is why the doctrine remains both appealing and deeply controversial. It promises peaceful rest while simultaneously suggesting that death might be less like sleeping and waking, and more like being unmade and remade, a proposition that troubles even those who find comfort in its simplicity. And yet, despite these philosophical contradictions, the doctrine persists because it offers what many find most precious in the face of mortality: the promise that death need not be experienced as a terrible ordeal, that the final moment might grant us unconsciousness rather than consciousness of our own ending, a mercy that perhaps matters more to us than whether the person who wakes is truly the same. Throughout human history and across nearly every culture on Earth, there exists a persistent and deeply troubling belief that the dead do not always remain confined to their graves or final resting places, but instead wander the physical world in a state of profound confusion, restlessness, or torment, unable or unwilling to accept the transition into whatever comes after death. This concept of the wandering dead manifests in countless forms across different traditions and time periods, from the restless spirits of European folklore who haunt the locations of their deaths or the places they cherished in life, to the vengeful ghosts of Asian cultures who seek justice for wrongs committed against them, to the tortured souls described in medieval Christian theology who exist in liminal spaces between heaven and hell, neither fully departed nor truly present among the living. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears to stem from humanity's difficulty in accepting the finality and absolute unknowability of death itself, combined with our profound discomfort with the idea that consciousness simply ceases to exist without warning or continuation. When we cannot fully comprehend what happens after death, we fill that void with narratives that allow the dead to remain somehow accessible, visible, or interactive with the living world, which paradoxically provides a strange comfort even while describing scenarios of genuine horror and suffering. The wandering dead theory allows us to maintain a subtle connection with those we have lost, to imagine that they might still be present in some form, still capable of communication or expression, still bound to places or people they loved when alive, and this fantasy persists despite the complete absence of verifiable scientific evidence or rational mechanism by which consciousness could continue functioning without a living brain. What is perhaps most unsettling about this belief is how deeply it has become woven into our collective consciousness, appearing not only in folklore and religious doctrine, but also in our entertainment, our architecture, our superstitions, and our casual conversations, to the point where many of us express genuine unease in locations we believe to be haunted or feel an inexplicable wariness when alone in places associated with death. Revealing just how profoundly this ancient fear persists within us regardless of our intellectual understanding of how the world actually works. Perhaps most tellingly, we continue to construct elaborate rituals and precautions specifically designed to appease or contain the wandering dead, from the salt lines and iron horseshoes of Western tradition to the offering ceremonies and prayer practices of Eastern cultures, as if some part of us genuinely believes that our actions in the present might still affect the comfort or behavior of those long departed, a legacy of magical thinking that survives even in our most rationalized, scientific age. Throughout human history, numerous religious and philosophical traditions have proposed that the ultimate punishment for moral transgression is not eternal suffering, but rather complete and total obliteration, the complete cessation of existence itself, where the wicked are simply erased from reality as though they never were. This concept emerged prominently in certain interpretations of Christian theology, Jewish mysticism, Islamic jurisprudence, and various ancient mystery religions, each suggesting that annihilation represents a form of divine justice more terrible than any finite torment could ever be. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates on several levels. First, it addresses the logical problem posed by eternal torture, which even many theologians found morally troubling when applied to an infinite God supposedly embodying perfect justice. Second, it provides psychological comfort to the righteous by suggesting that evil will not merely be punished, but completely erased, ensuring that wrongdoing has no permanent cosmic consequence. And third, it taps into the profound human existential terror of non-existence, making annihilation feel paradoxically both merciful and absolutely terrifying, depending on one's moral status. The theory persists across centuries and cultures despite lacking any empirical evidence whatsoever, and despite the fact that most people simultaneously believe in some form of afterlife, while also holding this contradictory belief in total obliteration for certain categories of people, without recognizing the inherent logical tension between these positions. What remains particularly striking is how this concept has become normalized within religious discourse, discussed as though it were established fact rather than speculative theology, and how it continues to influence criminal justice systems, social ostracism practices, and modern conceptions of redemption and irredeemability. The annihilation theory persists precisely because it serves multiple psychological functions simultaneously. It punishes without appearing sadistic, it reassures believers about cosmic justice, and it satisfies the deep human desire for finality and closure, allowing people to imagine that ultimate evil simply ceases to exist rather than persisting eternally. Yet this framework also reveals a troubling tendency within human morality: the impulse to render certain individuals not merely punished but unmemorable, erased from historical record and collective consciousness, a practice evident in everything from damnatio memoriae in ancient Rome to the modern phenomenon of cancellation, suggesting that annihilation may less reflect divine justice than express our deepest anxieties about being forgotten or deemed worthless. In this light, the concept of annihilation reveals less about cosmic justice and more about our fundamental need to believe that evil can be completely eliminated rather than merely contained or transformed. A comforting fiction that allows us to avoid the unsettling possibility that redemption might be necessary even for those we deem irredeemable, or conversely, that some harm is so profound it admits no adequate response, divine or otherwise. In the Norse mythological tradition that emerged from Scandinavian cultures between roughly the 3rd and 11th centuries, Valhalla represented one of humanity's most elaborate and psychologically compelling visions of an afterlife, reserved exclusively for the worthy dead, specifically warriors who fell honorably in battle, and were selected by the Valkyries, those supernatural female beings tasked with determining which slain combatants deserved eternal reward. The concept itself emerged from societies where warfare was not merely a political instrument, but a fundamental aspect of cultural identity, economic survival, and spiritual purpose, creating a desperate psychological need to transform the horrific reality of violent death into something meaningful, heroic, and ultimately desirable rather than tragic or wasteful. Within Valhalla's imagined halls, the chosen dead would spend eternity in a state of perpetual recreation, engaging in endless cycles of combat during the day where warriors would face one another in glorious battle, only to have their wounds miraculously healed as night fell, allowing them to feast, drink, and celebrate together in companionship before the cycle began anew at dawn, suggesting a profound human desire to turn suffering into pleasure and violence into virtue. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system functioned as a powerful incentive structure designed to encourage military service and fearless combat, transforming the prospect of death from a terrifying final conclusion into an aspirational destination that promised eternal glory, companionship, purpose, and pleasure to those bold enough to embrace it fully. What makes Valhalla particularly disturbing when examined through modern ethical frameworks is how it normalized and sanctified violence by promising ultimate reward for those most willing to kill and die, essentially creating a theological justification for warfare that transcended practical necessity and became a spiritual imperative worthy of celebration and longing. Yet despite living in an era where we have developed sophisticated philosophical and scientific understandings of human mortality, where we recognize war primarily as tragedy rather than glory, and where we possess far more complex moral frameworks for evaluating human worth and achievement, many modern societies continue to perpetuate similar psychological mechanisms under different names, honoring warriors as uniquely noble and deserving of special status, suggesting that Valhalla's underlying appeal persists in our collective consciousness still, transformed but fundamentally unchanged. We construct monuments to fallen soldiers, award posthumous medals, and speak of sacrifice in reverent tones that transform death in service of state into a kind of secular immortality, suggesting that the deep human need to believe that some deaths matter more than others, that some lives achieve a transcendence through violence that ordinary existence cannot provide, remains one of our most persistent and dangerous inheritances from that distant Scandinavian past. The ancient Egyptian conception of the afterlife presents one of history's most elaborate and psychologically disturbing frameworks for understanding death, a realm known as the Duat, which was envisioned not as a place of eternal peace or divine reward, but rather as an underworld filled with perilous trials, demonic entities, and an exhausting journey that the deceased soul had to navigate with perfect knowledge and unwavering determination. The Duat was believed to be a shadowy mirror of the living world, a realm of eternal darkness beneath the earth where the pharaohs and common people alike would find themselves after death, stripped of their physical bodies, but still possessing a spiritual essence that required both protection and guidance through countless supernatural obstacles and hostile forces that would attempt to prevent their passage toward the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians developed an entire industry around preparing for this journey, commissioning elaborate tomb paintings, papyrus scrolls containing spells and instructions known as the Book of the Dead, and surrounding themselves with amulets and artifacts designed specifically to help them navigate the Duat successfully, treating death not as an ending, but as the beginning of an exhausting examination that would test their knowledge, character, and ability to answer riddles and recite sacred names. This obsession emerged from a profound psychological need to create order and meaning from the absolute chaos and terror of mortality, transforming the unknowable darkness of death into a mapped territory with rules and procedures that could theoretically be mastered through proper preparation and education. The mechanism that sustained this belief system was the human mind's desperate desire to believe that death was not a random cessation of existence, but rather a comprehensible process with clear protocols, where knowledge and proper behavior could determine outcomes, allowing the living to feel some measure of control over an event that fundamentally represents the ultimate loss of control. What is remarkable is how this framework persisted for thousands of years, continuing to influence Egyptian culture, art, architecture, and religious practice despite its inherent absurdity, and how it demonstrates the extraordinary lengths humans will go to rationalize and systematize the most irrational fear. Constructing elaborate theological systems that required immense resources and labor simply to convince themselves that they could somehow prepare for the one experience that remains universally impenetrable to human understanding and lived experience. Yet perhaps this very impossibility was precisely the point. By constructing an elaborate map of the unmappable and creating detailed procedures for the unknowable, the ancient Egyptians transformed their helplessness into agency, converting existential terror into architectural grandeur and artistic achievement that would outlast civilization itself, proving that the human need to impose meaning on death may be more fundamental than death itself. In ancient Egyptian religious practice, the afterlife was not a place of automatic reward or punishment, but rather a destination that had to be earned through moral living and proper judgment, a concept so deeply embedded in their culture that it shaped not only their spiritual beliefs, but also their entire approach to death and preparation for eternity. The Egyptians believed that upon death, the deceased would be brought before Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and there would face a trial known as the weighing of the heart, in which the heart of the dead person would be placed upon one side of a great cosmic scale, while on the other side would be placed a single feather, specifically the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. The logic behind this supernatural mechanism was straightforward within their worldview. The human heart, they believed, was the seat of memory, emotion, and moral judgment, the very essence of a person's character and choices made during life, and therefore its literal weight would be a perfect measure of how truthfully and justly that person had lived. If the heart was heavier than the feather, it meant the person had accumulated the weight of lies, cruelty, betrayal, and wickedness during their lifetime, and they would be denied entry to the peaceful fields of Aru, instead facing eternal torment or obliteration of the soul. If the heart balanced perfectly with the feather, the person had lived a righteous life and would be granted passage to paradise, to exist eternally in a realm of peace and plenty. What makes this belief system particularly disturbing from a modern perspective is not merely the concept of cosmic judgment, but rather how this idea persists in some form across nearly every human civilization and spiritual tradition, suggesting that we have an almost universal psychological need to believe that our moral choices carry actual cosmic weight, that the universe itself is watching and keeping score, and that death is not an ending but an accountability that cannot be escaped. Despite our scientific understanding that the heart is merely a biological organ that pumps blood, and that no supernatural scale awaits us in any afterlife, the metaphorical power of the weighing of the heart continues to influence how we conceptualize morality, judgment, and the consequences of our actions. Embedded so deeply in our cultural consciousness that we speak of people having heavy consciences or light spirits without recognizing we are still using the ancient Egyptian measurement system. The fact that we have normalized this imagery that we continue to use it in literature, film, and religious contexts, suggests that we have never truly moved past the need to believe that goodness and badness are measurable quantities with objective weight in the universe, that our moral lives matter on a cosmic scale, regardless of what our rational minds tell us about the actual nature of death and the afterlife. In ancient Greek mythology, the River Lethe served as one of the 5 rivers of the underworld, a waterway that souls would cross during their journey through the afterlife, and its most distinctive feature was that any spirit who drank from its waters would experience complete and total obliteration of all memories from their previous life on Earth. The concept emerged from classical texts, including Plato's Republic and various other philosophical works, where the river was described as flowing through the depths of Hades, its waters possessing an almost supernatural quality that could strip away identity, personality, and every moment of lived experience that defined who a person had been. The mythology suggested that souls arriving at this juncture faced a fundamental choice: drink and be reborn into a new existence without the burden of their past, or refuse and retain their memories while moving forward into whatever judgment or reward awaited them in the afterlife proper. This theory addressed a profound human anxiety about the nature of self and consciousness after death, proposing that the continuity of memory might not survive the transition from life to death, and that perhaps our essential selves could be erased as completely as water washing away ink from parchment. The psychological mechanism underlying this concept appears rooted in our deepest fears about obsolescence and forgetting, the terror that everything we have experienced, every relationship formed and lesson learned, might simply cease to exist the moment we die, leaving us as blank slates in whatever comes next. Ancient philosophers seemed fascinated by the possibility that consciousness might be reset entirely, that the self we construct through accumulated experiences might not follow us beyond the mortal veil, and that death might represent not merely an ending, but a complete discontinuation of personhood. What remains striking about the River Lethe is how persistently the concept appears across centuries of Western thought, reinterpreted and reimagined by writers, poets, and theologians who recognized in it something fundamentally true about human vulnerability and the fragility of memory itself. From Dante's Divine Comedy to modern literature, artists have continued to grapple with Lethe's implications, using the river as a metaphor for trauma, loss, and the human capacity to move forward by sometimes choosing to forget, suggesting that while memory defines us, so too does our ability to release what no longer serves us. In this way, the River Lethe ultimately represents not a punishment but a paradox, the recognition that forgetting can be both a mercy and a loss, that the waters of oblivion might offer liberation from suffering while simultaneously erasing the very experiences that make us who we are, leaving us to wonder whether a life without memory is truly a life at all. Perhaps this is why the River Lethe has endured so powerfully in our collective imagination, because it forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that identity itself might be nothing more than the sum of our memories, and that without them, we would be fundamentally, irreducibly other than ourselves. Imagine a cosmos that does not end in silence or heat death, but rather in a spectacular collapse followed by an infinite rebirth, an eternal cycle in which the universe expands and contracts across unimaginable timescales, and with each cosmic pulse, reality itself is born anew, complete with new stars, new galaxies, and crucially, new versions of every consciousness that ever existed in the previous iteration. This is the cyclic universe theory, sometimes called eternal return or the phoenix cosmos, a proposal that fundamentally transforms our understanding of what happens after death by suggesting that death is merely a transition point in an infinitely repeating pattern of universal creation and destruction. In this model, when you die in this universe, your consciousness does not vanish into oblivion nor ascend to heaven, but instead waits in a state of non-existence until the current cosmic cycle completes its expansion, collapses back upon itself in a phenomenon called the Big Crunch, and then explodes outward once more in a new Big Bang, at which point you are reconstructed atom for atom, memory for memory, in the subsequent universe, effectively giving you infinite afterlives across infinite universes. The psychological appeal of this theory rests on its elegant solution to several existential anxieties simultaneously. It promises eternal existence without requiring supernatural elements. It provides a mechanistic and therefore scientific-sounding framework for personal continuation. and it transforms death from finality into cyclical renewal, allowing individuals to contemplate their own infinite recurrence across cosmic timescales. Yet despite its mathematical elegance in theoretical physics circles, the theory relies on assumptions that remain entirely speculative and scientifically unproven, including the notion that information can be perfectly preserved through a big crunch, that consciousness emerges identically in new universes despite infinite variation, and that the laws of physics would remain constant enough across cycles to enable such perfect recreation. What persists about this theory in popular consciousness, despite these scientific uncertainties, is perhaps our deep human resistance to accepting true finality, our intuitive sense that something as complex and aware as consciousness cannot simply cease to exist, and our profound comfort in imagining that somewhere in some form, across some cosmic expanse we cannot perceive or measure, we will exist again. This vision of cosmic recycling has captivated everyone from ancient philosophers who intuited cyclical time to modern physicists exploring conformal cyclic cosmology, yet it ultimately reveals more about our psychology than about physics. We craft these theories not because evidence compels us, but because the alternative, genuine non-existence, remains psychologically intolerable to the human mind that contemplates it. Between the moment of physical death and the final judgment or resurrection promised by various religious traditions, there exists a peculiar theological space known as the intermediate state, a concept that has haunted Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thought for centuries, proposing that the soul or consciousness enters a kind of suspended realm where it awaits its ultimate fate rather than immediately experiencing either eternal reward or eternal punishment. This theory emerged from the profound human difficulty in reconciling the apparent finality of death with deeply held beliefs about cosmic justice and the continuation of personal identity, creating a buffer zone that somehow feels more psychologically tolerable than the immediate alternatives, as if the soul requires a waiting room before facing its true destination. The mechanism behind this belief stems from our fundamental inability to accept that death represents either absolute nothingness or instantaneous judgment without appeal. And so religious scholars and philosophers constructed an intermediate period where souls might experience temporary peace, temporary torment, or even opportunity for continued spiritual development or purification, effectively extending the narrative of individual existence beyond the grave while providing a temporal structure that mirrors earthly concepts of justice and process. In Catholic theology, this evolved into the concept of purgatory, where souls undergo refinement before entering heaven, while Protestant traditions suggested sleep or unconsciousness, and Islamic thought proposes the barzakh, an unseen realm where souls remain conscious but separated from physical reality until the day of resurrection, each formulation attempting to answer unanswerable questions about timing, consciousness, and fairness in the afterlife. What remains remarkable is how this concept persists across diverse religious traditions despite having no empirical foundation whatsoever, no testimonial consistency between cultures, and no logical resolution to its central paradox. If God or the universe operates outside time, why would an intermediate waiting period be necessary? And if consciousness ends at death, what exactly experiences this intermediate state? Yet the theory endures because it provides comfort through delay, suggesting that judgment is not instantaneous and irreversible, that there remains some temporal space in which outcomes might be influenced, reconsidered, or understood, transforming death from an absolute threshold into merely another transition point in an extended narrative. This psychological necessity for temporal buffer zones reveals itself not only in religious doctrine, but in secular mourning rituals and memorial practices, where societies construct intermediate periods of remembrance, wakes, sitting Shiva, 40-day commemorations, that serve the same function of softening death's abruptness and allowing the living to process loss through structured time rather than confronting it as instantaneous obliteration. In ancient Greek mythology, Tartarus represents one of the most horrifying and theoretically inescapable regions of the underworld, a place of eternal suffering that exists far beneath even Hades itself, separated from the mortal realm by layers of darkness and distance that make it fundamentally unreachable and incomprehensible to the living mind. The concept emerged from a civilization deeply preoccupied with questions of divine punishment and cosmic justice, developing an elaborate framework in which the worst offenders against the gods or humanity would be consigned to this abyssal prison, where they would endure torments specifically tailored to their crimes. suffering not for days or years, but for eternity itself, with no possibility of redemption or release. Tartarus was said to be surrounded by bronze walls and guarded by the Titans themselves, making it a kind of ultimate supernatural maximum security facility designed to contain beings so dangerous or so offensive that conventional death was insufficient punishment, requiring instead an entire cosmological location dedicated exclusively to their endless torment. The psychological mechanism behind Tartarus reveals humanity's fundamental need to believe in proportional consequences that extend beyond the natural boundaries of mortality. The human imagination refusing to accept that life's greatest injustices might go unpunished, or that the universe could be indifferent to moral violations. Creating instead a comprehensive metaphysical system where no crime escapes accountability, and where the worst possible outcomes are reserved for those who deserve them most. What persists in this ancient theory, despite its complete lack of empirical support, is the deeply embedded human conviction that suffering must mean something, that the universe operates according to moral principles rather than random chance, and that somewhere in some form, cosmic justice will ultimately prevail over human wickedness. A belief so foundational to our sense of meaning that we have integrated it into virtually every religious and philosophical system ever created. Regardless of whether we possess any actual evidence that such metaphysical punishment exists. Yet this yearning for cosmic accountability persists even in our modern, scientifically informed era, manifesting not in literal underworlds, but in our contemporary anxieties about karma, comeuppance, and the eventual exposure of hidden wrongdoing, suggesting that Tartarus endures less as a geographical location than as a psychological necessity, a permanent feature of human consciousness that demands the universe be fundamentally just. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence that injustice often flourishes unchecked. Across virtually every human culture and religious tradition spanning thousands of years, there exists a persistent belief in entities known as psychopomps, supernatural beings whose sole responsibility is to guide the souls of the recently deceased from the realm of the living into whatever afterlife awaits them. In ancient Egyptian mythology, the jackal-headed god Anubis would lead souls through the underworld toward judgment, while in Greek tradition, Hermes or Charon would ferry the dead across the River Styx toward Hades. Medieval Christian art depicts angels descending at the moment of death to collect righteous souls, just as darker figures arrive to claim the damned. Islamic theology speaks of Azrael, the angel of death, who appears at the precise moment of a person's passing to separate the soul from the body. Norse mythology envisions Valkyries swooping down to select fallen warriors for eternal glory in Valhalla. In Japanese Buddhism, Amida Buddha himself comes to greet the dying and transport them to paradise. What makes psychopomp belief so deeply disturbing is not merely the imagery of supernatural entities manifesting at humanity's most vulnerable moment, but rather the psychological comfort derived from believing that death is never a solitary journey, that some external force has already been assigned the task of shepherding us safely across an otherwise incomprehensible threshold. The mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in humanity's fundamental terror of the unknown and our desperate need to impose order and guidance upon the chaos of mortality. By imagining that a designated guide awaits us, we convert death from an arbitrary erasure into a structured transition, complete with predetermined routes and celestial escorts. This transforms the most frightening moment imaginable into something almost bureaucratic, almost manageable. Yet what persists as truly unsettling is how universal and unwavering this belief has remained despite complete absence of verifiable evidence. No documented account of a psychopomp has ever withstood scientific scrutiny. No deathbed visions have proven reproducible or consistent across independent observers. Still, across continents and centuries, humanity continues creating increasingly elaborate mythologies around these spectral guides, each generation refining the details while the core belief remains unshaken, suggesting that some psychological needs transcend reason itself. Perhaps most remarkably, even those who consciously reject supernatural explanations often report experiencing vivid presences or profound peace in their final moments, suggesting that the psychopomp may ultimately be less a creature to be feared than a deeply embedded psychological mechanism that activates precisely when we need it most. Whether manifested through religious faith, cultural conditioning, or the brain's final neurochemical cascade, the psychopomp endures as humanity's most universal answer to our deepest question, that we need not face oblivion alone, and that something, anything, waits on the other side to receive us. In ancient Greek mythology, the River Styx served as a fundamental boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, a watery barrier that souls could not cross without proper passage and payment, and this concept persisted throughout Western civilization for millennia as one of the most concrete and psychologically grounded descriptions of what happens when we die. Because it provided a tangible explanation for the finality of death and the irreversibility of the transition from life to whatever comes after. The mythology dictated that when a person died, their soul or shade would emerge from their body and find itself stranded on the mortal shore, unable to proceed into the afterlife without the assistance of Charon, the ferryman, who would transport departed souls across the dark, murky waters in exchange for an obol, a small coin that had to be placed in the dead person's mouth or buried with them. And this transactional relationship between the living and the dead created a psychological framework where death became not merely an ending but a process, a journey that required preparation, respect, and financial obligation that connected the world of the living to the world of the dead in an almost contractual manner. The deeper mechanism at work in this belief system stemmed from humanity's profound discomfort with the unknown and our need to impose order, structure, and comprehensible rules onto the incomprehensible mystery of death itself, transforming an unknowable void into a navigable landscape with defined geography, specific inhabitants, and clear procedures, which made death feel less like annihilation and more like relocation. A place where the dead existed in some form rather than ceasing entirely, and this provided immense psychological comfort to living populations who desperately wanted to believe that their departed loved ones were somewhere, anywhere, rather than nowhere at all. What remains remarkable is how this ancient metaphor continues to echo through modern culture and consciousness despite our scientific understanding of death, despite our knowledge that there is no actual river, no actual ferryman, no actual exchange of coins that would grant passage to any afterlife. Yet people still speak of crossing over, of transitions, of boundaries between worlds, demonstrating how thoroughly we have internalized this particular framework for conceptualizing death as a border crossing rather than a cessation. And this normalization suggests that the human mind requires these metaphorical structures so deeply that we cannot help but perpetuate them even when we consciously reject their literal truth. The River Styx thus represents not merely an ancient myth, but a fundamental language through which we still attempt to articulate the unarticulate, a metaphorical currency that allows us to transact with the incomprehensible. And in this sense, Charon's obol remains in our collective pocket, ready to be spent whenever we must speak of those who have crossed into silence. Consider the haunting possibility that the human soul does not remain unified after death, but instead shatters into distinct, autonomous fragments, each carrying different aspects of the self into the afterlife in complete isolation from the others. This theory suggests that our consciousness, our memories, our desires, our moral conscience, and our essential identity do not journey together as a cohesive whole, but rather splinter apart at the moment of death, scattering like shards of broken glass across multiple dimensions or planes of existence. Some proponents of this framework have proposed that each fragment becomes trapped in its own experiential bubble, condemned to relive certain moments of the deceased's life, without access to the broader context that might bring meaning or redemption. One fragment might eternally experience the shame of a single moral transgression, while another fragment simultaneously experiences the joy of an innocent memory, yet these two parts remain forever incapable of communicating or finding resolution together. The mechanism underlying this theory often emerges from attempts to reconcile the inconsistencies we observe in human psychology during life itself, particularly when examining dissociative disorders, multiple personality conditions, or the compartmentalization of trauma that humans employ as a survival mechanism. If the mind can fragment and separate itself while still alive, the reasoning suggests, then perhaps the death of the physical body merely completes this fragmentation, removing the biological apparatus that previously held disparate psychological elements in proximity. What remains deeply disturbing about this concept is not simply its logical incoherence, but rather the way it transforms the afterlife into a nightmare of permanent alienation, where the unified self that feared death is erased entirely, replaced instead by countless suffering fragments that never experience wholeness or peace. never understand their own existence, and never meet again across whatever eternities may follow their dissolution. In this fragmented state, one might imagine a fragment of a mother's soul experiencing only the anguish of her children's suffering, forever severed from the fragment containing her love for them, while another fragment remains locked in the moment of her death, unable to progress or find closure. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of this theory lies in its suggestion that the unified I we experience throughout life, the continuous narrative self that binds memory to identity to purpose, is merely an illusion maintained by biological accident, an illusion that death strips away to reveal the true chaos beneath. And yet, if this fragmentation were true, we might expect the living to show far greater evidence of their soul's underlying fractures, not merely in pathology, but in the universal human experience of internal conflict, where we genuinely cannot reconcile our competing desires and values, suggesting that perhaps we are already partially fragmented, already experiencing the isolation that death would only finalize and make permanent. Conditional immortality represents one of the most psychologically complex afterlife theories because it fundamentally rests on the idea that eternal life is not automatically granted to all human beings, but rather must be earned through specific conditions, beliefs, or moral conduct during one's earthly existence. Unlike traditional concepts of the soul that suggest all consciousness continues indefinitely after death, conditional immortality proposes that only certain individuals, typically those who have achieved enlightenment, maintained proper faith, lived virtuously, or met particular spiritual requirements, will experience any form of continued existence whatsoever, while others will simply cease to exist entirely, facing what some traditions call the second death. This theory has deep roots in various religious and philosophical frameworks, from certain interpretations of Christian theology to Buddhist concepts of rebirth contingent upon karmic accumulation, and it creates a profoundly unsettling psychological framework where death itself becomes not merely an ending, but potentially a punishment or consequence of failure during life. The mechanism underlying conditional immortality operates on a fundamental principle of cosmic justice or divine judgment, suggesting that the universe itself maintains some accounting system where souls are evaluated against predetermined standards, and those found wanting are extinguished rather than condemned to eternal torment, which some adherents actually view as more merciful than the alternative. This concept taps into deep human anxieties about worthiness, about whether our lives have been sufficiently meaningful or morally sound, and it creates a constant undertone of existential evaluation where every choice potentially contributes to or detracts from one's qualification for continued existence. What makes conditional immortality particularly persistent despite its troubling implications is that it allows believers to simultaneously hold hope for their own continuation, while maintaining a rational framework that acknowledges not everyone deserves immortality, and it provides a psychological mechanism for understanding inequality and suffering by suggesting that those who die may simply not have met the universe's standards for preservation, transforming death from random tragedy into earned outcome. Yet this framework also reveals a darker psychological function. It allows the living to rationalize the deaths of others, particularly the young, the suffering, or the marginalized, as evidence of their spiritual inadequacy, transforming grief and injustice into a reassuring narrative where the universe operates according to merit rather than chance, thereby protecting believers from the terrifying randomness of mortality itself. In Christian theology, particularly within medieval and Eastern Orthodox traditions, there exists a doctrine known as the Harrowing of Hell, which proposes that following his crucifixion and death, Jesus Christ descended into the underworld, not to remain there in eternal torment, but to actively rescue the souls of the righteous who had died before his incarnation. According to this theory, figures such as Abraham, Moses, David, and the prophets of the Old Testament were trapped in a place called Sheol or Limbo, a holding area neither fully hellish nor heavenly, awaiting the redemptive power that only Christ could provide. The harrowing itself describes a dramatic liberation event where Christ allegedly broke the bonds of death itself, defeated the powers of darkness that held dominion over these souls, and led them triumphantly out of captivity into paradise. This concept emerged from attempts to reconcile the problem of how virtuous people who lived before Christ could enter heaven without his explicit salvation, creating a theological framework that demanded Christ's redemptive work extend backward through time itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory reflects a deep human need to resolve paradoxes within religious systems, and to ensure that cosmic justice operates fairly regardless of historical accident of birth, essentially requiring that no righteous person remains excluded from salvation due to temporal circumstances beyond their control. What persists as remarkable is that despite the lack of direct biblical textual support for such an elaborate descent narrative, and despite the logical complexities of a time-transcending redemption, this doctrine became embedded within official Christian liturgy, most famously appearing in the Apostles' Creed, where it simply states that Christ descended into hell. The theory has survived for nearly 2,000 years, continuously reinterpreted and reformulated by theologians, normalized into creeds recited weekly by millions, achieving a status of unquestioned doctrine that transforms an elaborate speculative solution to a theological problem into established historical spiritual fact. Yet this transformation reveals how theological speculation, once canonized through liturgical repetition and institutional authority, acquires the weight of revealed truth, demonstrating the powerful mechanism by which human interpretations of religious texts become indistinguishable from their original sources, fundamentally altering how believers understand the nature of salvation itself across generations. Metempsychosis is the ancient belief that the human soul undergoes a cycle of reincarnation, transmigrating from one body to another across countless lifetimes, moving through various forms of existence, both human and animal, and potentially progressing or regressing based on the moral quality of one's previous life. This concept emerged thousands of years ago in cultures spanning from ancient Egypt to India to Greece, where it took root as a foundational explanation for suffering, moral inequality, and the apparent unfairness of human circumstance. The theory proposed that a person born into poverty or disease was not simply unlucky, but rather was experiencing the karmic consequences of misdeeds committed in a previous incarnation, just as the wealthy or healthy were reaping rewards from past virtue. This framework created a coherent metaphysical architecture in which every detail of human existence, every advantage and disadvantage, every talent and limitation could be traced back to moral choices made by the same essential self across previous lifetimes. The psychological mechanism that sustains metempsychosis operates through several interconnected elements that give it tremendous staying power despite its complete lack of empirical evidence. First, it satisfies a fundamental human need to find meaning in suffering and injustice, providing a narrative structure that transforms random misfortune into earned consequence. Second, it offers hope to those presently suffering by suggesting their circumstances are temporary and improvable through moral action in this life, creating a sense of agency and purpose even in the face of circumstances beyond one's control. Third, it provides a framework for understanding human diversity and difference without requiring uncomfortable conversations about systemic inequality or genetic variation, instead attributing difference to the spiritual achievements of previous lives. The theory also resolves the theological problem of divine justice, answering why a benevolent God would permit innocent children to suffer by suggesting that no one is truly innocent before they are born. What remains striking is that metempsychosis persists as a meaningful concept in contemporary society, despite our scientific understanding of consciousness, neurology, and the absence of any mechanism by which memories or moral essence could transfer between bodies. Yet we continue to see reincarnation narratives in popular entertainment, therapeutic contexts, and spiritual communities worldwide. This persistence suggests that the human mind remains deeply attached to explanatory frameworks that provide meaning and continuity in the face of mortality and injustice, even when rational thought acknowledges their impossibility, indicating that our need for metaphysical coherence often supersedes our commitment to empirical truth. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one of humanity's most detailed descriptions of the afterlife experience, there exists a phenomenon known as the clear light, a moment of pure consciousness said to occur at the instant of death, where the dying person confronts an undeniable, blinding luminosity that represents the fundamental nature of reality itself, and those who recognize it in that crucial moment are believed to achieve liberation instantly, while those who fail to recognize it due to fear. Confusion or spiritual unpreparedness are said to fall away into the bardos, the intermediate states between death and rebirth, beginning a long and terrifying journey through hallucinatory realms populated by wrathful deities and their own karmic manifestations. The mechanism underlying this belief appears to be rooted in actual neurological phenomena that occur during the dying process, where the sudden cessation of normal brain function and the flooding of endogenous chemicals, such as dimethyltryptamine and other compounds, may produce an overwhelming sensation of light and a dissolution of the boundary between self and universe. Creating a state of consciousness so profound and so utterly unlike ordinary experience that it naturally demands explanation through spiritual or transcendent frameworks rather than through the mundane language of neuroscience. What makes the clear light particularly persistent in human consciousness across cultures and centuries is precisely how it bridges the gap between subjective experience and objective reality, offering a narrative structure that transforms what might otherwise be merely a physiological event into something cosmically meaningful and personally transformative, suggesting that death is not an ending, but a moment of ultimate truth where the nature of existence is finally revealed. We have normalized this belief not through any scientific validation, but through the sheer eloquence and internal consistency of the descriptions provided in texts like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which present the clear light with such specificity and such psychological precision that it feels more like a detailed observation than a speculative doctrine. Allowing generations of practitioners and believers to approach death not with existential dread, but with the sense that they are moving toward a moment of ultimate clarity and recognition. Yet this reframing of death as recognition rather than annihilation may be precisely what allows human beings to face their mortality with dignity, transforming the unbearable finality of existence into a narrative of awakening, where the last moment of life becomes not a void to be feared but a threshold to be understood, and in that understanding, death itself becomes a kind of profound homecoming. In ancient Greek cosmology, Hades represented not merely a single location, but rather an entire underworld kingdom governed by the god of the same name, a realm where all souls descended after death regardless of their moral character or earthly conduct, existing as shadowy, diminished versions of their former selves in a place of neither reward nor punishment, but rather an eternity of monotonous existence stripped of the vitality and sensations that defined mortal life. The ancient Greeks constructed this elaborate afterlife mythology during periods when they possessed limited understanding of death itself, when the finality and unknowability of mortality created profound existential anxiety that demanded explanation and structure. And so they projected their fears and philosophical frameworks onto the darkness beyond the veil, creating a systematic geography of the afterlife complete with rivers to cross, judges to face, and shades who wandered endlessly through gray landscapes, remembering the warmth of the sun they would never feel again. The psychological mechanism underlying this particular vision of the afterlife reflects humanity's deep-seated need to impose order on chaos, to insist that death follows rules and processes rather than simple cessation, to believe that some version of ourselves continues rather than dissolves entirely, and this need became so powerful that entire civilizations organized their religious practices, moral systems, and funerary customs around the assumption that Hades was genuinely real, and that proper burial and tribute to the dead could actually influence the experience of those dwelling in that subterranean kingdom. What remains particularly striking about the persistence of Hades-like conceptions of the afterlife across countless cultures and centuries is how thoroughly they have normalized the idea that death is not an ending but a continuation, that existence persists in some diminished or transformed state, and that we should structure our entire approach to mortality around placating forces and entities that likely never existed. Creating elaborate systems of meaning and behavior predicated on assumptions that have never been verified and cannot be verified, yet continue to influence human thought and action even in our modern era. Yet even as scientific understanding has rendered such mythological frameworks obsolete, the emotional architecture that Hades provided, the comfort of narrative, the promise of continuation, the assurance that death operates according to comprehensible principles, remains so psychologically valuable that contemporary secular societies have struggled to develop equally compelling alternatives, leaving many individuals to navigate mortality with less existential scaffolding than their ancient predecessors possessed. This absence of mythological certainty may ultimately represent progress, a more honest reckoning with the unknowable, yet it comes at the cost of the psychological peace that Hades once provided, leaving contemporary humans to construct their own meaning in the face of mortality's silence, whether through philosophy, legacy, or the simple act of living fully within the time that remains measurable and real. In ancient Hebrew thought, Long before the crystallized concepts of heaven and hell emerged in later Christian and Islamic theology, there existed a far more ambiguous and unsettling vision of the afterlife known as Sheol, a shadowy realm that functioned less as a place of judgment and more as a universal repository for all the dead, regardless of their moral standing during life. Sheol appears throughout the Hebrew Bible as an underground abyss, a vast and empty chamber where the deceased existed in a state of perpetual dimness and semi-consciousness, neither punished nor rewarded, but rather suspended in a kind of spiritual torpor where the dead retained some awareness of their condition, yet possessed no capacity for joy, sorrow, or meaningful experience. The ancient Hebrews conceived of this realm as a place of dust and darkness, a location literally beneath the earth where all souls descended together, where kings and paupers shared the same pale and meaningless existence, where there was no distinction between the righteous and the wicked, no divine judgment waiting to separate the worthy from the condemned. What makes Sheol particularly disturbing as an afterlife concept is its profound indifference to morality and the complete erasure of individual identity and purpose that the dead experienced within it, creating a vision of existence so utterly devoid of meaning that even the worst punishments seem preferable to the mere continuation of consciousness in such emptiness. The psychological mechanism behind the development and persistence of Sheol among ancient Hebrew peoples appears rooted in their attempt to reconcile the observable reality that good people often suffered while alive with a broader theological framework that still maintained belief in divine order. And by envisioning the afterlife as an equally bleak destination for all, they avoided the contradictory problem of needing to explain why God allowed the righteous to suffer if eternal reward awaited them. Yet despite the logical inadequacy of this concept and its replacement by more elaborate afterlife theories in later religious traditions, the image of Sheol has persisted in Western consciousness for thousands of years, embedding itself in our literature, our language, and our deepest anxieties about death itself, so that even those unfamiliar with its Hebrew origins carry within their cultural memory the haunting fear that death might not be a transition to judgment or peace, but rather a descent into meaningless silence where we would exist without purpose, recognition, or hope for all eternity. This fear finds expression in the modern existentialist tradition, where thinkers like Sartre and Camus grapple with a universe equally indifferent to human meaning, suggesting that Sheol's ancient horror, the confrontation with absolute emptiness, remains the fundamental human anxiety beneath all philosophical inquiry into existence and mortality. Nirvana represents one of the most paradoxical and conceptually elusive afterlife theories ever seriously contemplated, originating from Buddhist and Hindu philosophical traditions that fundamentally reject the Western notion of a heavenly paradise or eternal conscious existence. Rather than promising eternal life, eternal happiness, or reunion with loved ones in some celestial realm, Nirvana proposes something far more disturbing to the Western mind: the complete cessation of existence, the dissolution of the self, and the permanent extinction of consciousness, desire, and individual identity. The theory emerged from the observation that human suffering arises from attachment, craving, and the illusion of a permanent self, and therefore the ultimate liberation could only come through the complete annihilation of these conditions. What makes this concept so deeply unsettling is that it reframes death not as a transition to another form of life, but as the ultimate goal, a state so profoundly empty and void that it transcends even our capacity to experience it, because there would be no experiencer remaining to perceive it. The psychological mechanism underlying Nirvana's appeal lies in its answer to a specific form of existential dread, the fear of suffering itself rather than death itself, suggesting that if we could simply stop existing, we would simultaneously stop suffering, a proposition that resonates deeply with those experiencing profound pain or existential fatigue. The disturbing brilliance of this theory is that it promises relief so complete that you cannot experience the relief. You cannot appreciate the absence of suffering because you would no longer be present to do so. Yet billions of practitioners have embraced this framework not with despair, but with spiritual dedication, suggesting that we have collectively normalized the idea of personal non-existence as enlightenment and treated the permanent erasure of consciousness as something to actively pursue rather than fear. This paradox reveals something profound about human consciousness, that we are capable of reframing annihilation itself as humanity's highest achievement, transforming the void into enlightenment through philosophical architecture so elegant that the prospect of ceasing to exist becomes not a terrifying endpoint, but a sacred destination worthy of lifelong spiritual discipline and meditation. Yet perhaps this is precisely what makes nirvana so intellectually honest as an afterlife theory. Unlike frameworks that promise continued consciousness, pleasure, or reunion, it refuses to deceive us with comforting fictions, instead demanding that we confront the possibility that non-existence might not be a punishment to fear, but simply the natural conclusion of a temporary phenomenon, consciousness itself, that arose from matter and may ultimately return to it, asking us whether we can find peace not in denial of this reality, but in acceptance of it. Within the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain philosophical traditions lies a concept that proposes the ultimate dissolution of individual consciousness into an infinite, undifferentiated state of pure being, a condition known as moksha or liberation, wherein the self ceases to exist as a separate entity and merges entirely with Brahman, the universal consciousness that underlies all reality. In this framework, the afterlife does not consist of eternal paradise or punishment, but rather the complete annihilation of the ego, the dissolution of all desires, attachments, and the very sense of I that defines human existence, suggesting that what we perceive as our individual identity is ultimately nothing more than an elaborate illusion created by Maya, the cosmic principle of illusion that veils our perception of ultimate truth. The psychological mechanism sustaining this theory rests upon the observation that human suffering appears fundamentally rooted in our attachment to a separate self, our endless craving for permanence in an impermanent universe, and our inability to accept the transient nature of all phenomena. And therefore the promise of moksha functions as a resolution to this existential anxiety by offering a state where such suffering becomes impossible, because the very consciousness that experiences suffering has ceased to exist as an independent entity. What remains particularly striking about moksha is that millions of practitioners throughout history have pursued this goal through rigorous meditation, ascetic practices, and philosophical study, dedicating their entire lives to achieving a state of non-being, a condition that Western psychology might interpret as the ultimate form of dissociation or ego death. Yet within these traditions, this represents the highest achievement possible, the ultimate success rather than a pathological breakdown. The persistence of moksha as a pursued spiritual objective across millennia and throughout diverse cultures suggests that the human mind possesses a profound capacity to find meaning in the pursuit of non-meaning, to organize entire philosophical systems around the goal of personal dissolution, and to view the obliteration of individual consciousness not as annihilation, but as the most desirable form of transcendence imaginable. This paradox reveals something profound about human consciousness itself, that the deepest fulfillment may lie not in accumulating experiences or solidifying identity, but in releasing the very framework through which we construct meaning, suggesting that liberation and annihilation might represent two perspectives on the same transformative threshold. Yet perhaps this is the ultimate wisdom, that the self we so desperately cling to and defend throughout our lives is itself the primary obstacle to understanding reality, and that the courage to surrender this illusion entirely, to dissolve into the infinite, represents not defeat but the most profound act of acceptance the human spirit can achieve. Within Mahayana Buddhism, particularly in East Asian traditions, exists one of the most elaborate and psychologically sophisticated afterlife concepts ever conceived. The Pure Land, a celestial realm said to exist in the western direction, created and maintained by Amitabha Buddha, a being of infinite compassion who made a cosmic vow to ensure that all who call upon his name with sincere faith would be reborn into his realm rather than continuing the cycle of suffering through repeated reincarnation. This is not presented as a distant, abstract theological concept, but rather as a tangible destination, a place where the conditions for achieving enlightenment are so perfect, so systematically optimized, that even those of limited spiritual capacity can progress toward Buddhahood without facing the crushing difficulties and temptations of earthly existence. The Pure Land itself is described in extraordinary detail across Buddhist scriptures. Jeweled trees bearing fruit, lotus ponds of crystal water where the reborn are said to emerge from lotus blossoms in adolescent form, the constant presence of celestial music and teachings, and the complete absence of suffering, disease, aging, or any of the natural torments that characterize human life. The mechanism underlying this belief system operates on a profoundly psychological level, functioning as a theodicy that addresses the central problem of existence itself. If enlightenment requires moral perfection and spiritual discipline, why are we born into circumstances that make such achievement nearly impossible? The Pure Land theory resolves this paradox through delegation, suggesting that we need not achieve enlightenment through our own effort, but rather can rely on the accumulated merit and compassion of another being, Amitabha, whose vow becomes our salvation. This transforms the entire religious undertaking from an impossible personal struggle into an act of faith and devotion, placing salvation within reach of the most ordinary person, the most broken individual, the most spiritually compromised human being who has ever lived. Despite its logical circularity and the complete absence of empirical evidence for either Amitabha Buddha or his realm, Pure Land Buddhism has persisted for nearly 2,000 years, developing sophisticated philosophical frameworks that justify its claims, and becoming the dominant form of Buddhism practiced by hundreds of millions of people across Asia and throughout the contemporary world. The appeal of this system lies not in its metaphysical verifiability, but in its psychological efficacy. It offers practitioners a coherent narrative that transforms helplessness into hope, that dignifies ordinary suffering by positioning it as a temporary condition rather than a permanent reflection of one's spiritual worth, and that democratizes enlightenment by suggesting that sincere devotion can accomplish what austere discipline cannot. Apokatastasis, a concept derived from ancient Greek Christian theology, represents one of the most profound and systematically suppressed theories about the ultimate fate of all souls, proposing that eventually every being in existence, without exception, including Satan himself and the most wicked of all demons, will ultimately be reconciled with God and granted salvation through an infinite process of spiritual refinement and redemption. This idea emerged primarily through the writings of Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century, who envisioned a cosmos so fundamentally structured around divine love and omnipotent power that no force, no matter how resistant or corrupted, could remain eternally separated from reunion with the divine source. And this vision contradicted the emerging orthodoxy of eternal damnation and permanent separation that would come to dominate mainstream Christian eschatology for nearly 2,000 years thereafter. The psychological mechanism operating within apokatastasis rests on a profound logical paradox that theologians have long grappled with. If God is simultaneously all-powerful, all-knowing, and infinitely loving, then how could an all-powerful being create a system where punishment extends eternally without end, where torture persists beyond any conceivable redemptive purpose, and where the supposed architect of infinite love permits infinite suffering to continue forevermore in the depths of hell? A contradiction that apokatastasis attempts to resolve by reimagining the afterlife as an ultimately merciful cosmic drama, where even the most severe punishments serve rehabilitative rather than purely retributive ends. The theory persists in theological circles despite systematic institutional suppression because it appeals to our deepest intuitions about fairness, because it resolves logical inconsistencies in traditional doctrine, because it aligns with an understanding of love as genuine and transformative rather than conditional and punitive. And yet most mainstream religious institutions have effectively buried this concept beneath centuries of orthodoxy, teaching instead that damnation is eternal and irrevocable, a normalization that remains so complete that most people today never encounter apokatastasis at all, never realize that alternative visions once competed equally within Christian thought, and accept without question the hell they were taught to fear. Yet in moments of genuine theological honesty, in the writings of later Christian mystics, in the apocryphal texts quietly preserved by monasteries, in the private doubts of priests confronting the logical impossibilities of eternal torment, apokatastasis resurfaces as an almost irrepressible human intuition, a whisper suggesting that the universe's final chapter might be one of reconciliation rather than irreversible division. And that perhaps the most radical act of faith is believing that even God's justice operates ultimately in service of love rather than its negation. The ancient Greeks envisioned a place called the Elysian Fields, a paradise reserved exclusively for the heroic dead, the virtuous, and those favored by the gods, where souls would exist in perpetual peace and pleasure, free from the suffering and hardship that characterized mortal existence. And this concept represented one of humanity's earliest and most elaborate attempts to create a hierarchical system of afterlife reward based on earthly conduct and divine preference. In this theoretical framework, The worthy would spend eternity in lush meadows bathed in eternal sunlight, engaging in pleasant pursuits and reuniting with loved ones who had similarly achieved this elevated status, while the ordinary masses faced either oblivion or exile to the gray and cheerless realm of Hades, a place devoid of sensation, memory, or meaning. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system operated on a profound level within human consciousness, functioning as both a moral incentive structure and a coping mechanism for mortality itself, since the prospect of eternal punishment or emptiness motivated adherence to societal values and ethical codes, while the promise of paradisal reward transformed the fear of death into anticipation and hope, thereby providing existential comfort in the face of inevitable demise. What makes the Elysian Fields particularly disturbing when examined through a modern lens is not merely its promise of eternal pleasure, but rather its systematic exclusion of the majority of humanity, the way it codified inequality and hierarchy even in the afterlife, suggesting that even death itself could not be an equalizer, that some souls inherently deserved better than others based on circumstances largely beyond individual control. Yet despite our contemporary scientific understanding that consciousness likely ceases at death and that posthumous judgment cannot logically exist, we have never truly abandoned this hierarchical thinking about the afterlife, instead simply reshaping it into new forms, whether through religious reward systems, karma and reincarnation cycles, or the secular notion that legacy and memory constitute a kind of earthly immortality reserved for the accomplished and remembered. Demonstrating how thoroughly the Elysian Fields model has embedded itself into human cultural memory. The comfort we derive from imagining such distinctions, that greatness will be remembered, that virtue will be recognized, that death need not erase all hierarchy, reveals how desperately we cling to the notion that existence itself is meaningful and stratified, that our choices matter enough to echo beyond the grave, even as we consciously reject the mythological frameworks that once made such beliefs feel inevitable and true. Perhaps this is why we construct monuments and museums, why we obsessively document our achievements and curate our digital legacies, not merely as practical records, but as desperate attempts to secure a place in the Elysian Fields of collective memory, transforming the ancient myth into a modern religion where immortality is purchased through visibility and cultural significance rather than heroic virtue or divine favor. Deep within theosophical and spiritual traditions lies one of the most intriguing and troubling concepts about what happens after death. The Akashic Records, a supposed cosmic library or universal consciousness that supposedly contains the entire history of existence, every thought, every action, and every moment that has ever occurred, written into the fabric of reality itself like an infinite cosmic hard drive accessible only to those who have transcended physical death or achieved certain elevated states of consciousness. The concept emerged prominently in the late 19th century through the teachings of Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, who claimed that advanced spiritual practitioners and those in the afterlife could access these records, reviewing their past lives, understanding karmic patterns, and perceiving truths about the universe that ordinary living humans could never comprehend. The disturbing implications are profound. If such records exist, then not only is every action we take permanently documented in some non-physical dimension, but the dead themselves supposedly have access to this omniscient archive, meaning souls in the afterlife can review every mistake, every unkind word, every selfish decision a person made during their earthly existence, experiencing a form of eternal surveillance and judgment that extends beyond death into whatever realm they inhabit next. The psychological mechanism behind this belief appears rooted in humanity's deep-seated anxiety about accountability and the desire for cosmic justice. The idea that nothing is ever truly forgotten, that the universe keeps perfect records, and that we cannot escape judgment or consequences provides a peculiar comfort even as it terrifies us, because it suggests that morality matters on a universal scale and that truth ultimately cannot be hidden. The concept has persisted for over a century despite complete lack of scientific evidence or any reproducible method of accessing these alleged records, becoming absorbed into New Age spirituality, past-life regression therapy, and contemporary discussions about consciousness, where it now operates as accepted metaphorical truth within certain communities. Normalized through repetition and blended seamlessly into modern spiritual language, even though it remains fundamentally a belief system without empirical foundation or logical demonstration of how non-physical information could be stored or retrieved in any measurable way. Yet perhaps the record's greatest power lies not in their hypothetical existence, but in their function as a psychological mirror. Believers who consult supposed Akashic information often report profound personal insights and healing, suggesting that whether the records are real cosmic archives or elaborate projections of the human mind seeking meaning and redemption, they serve the same transformative purpose, allowing people to narrativize their lives as part of something vast and meaningful rather than random and forgotten. Consider the experience of standing in a place where someone you loved has recently died, and feeling as though some essential part of them still lingers in that space, dispersed throughout the room like a subtle presence that cannot be fully grasped or articulated, but somehow remains tangible to your emotional perception. This phenomenon, known as soul diffusion, proposes that consciousness and identity do not depart cleanly from the physical world upon death, but instead gradually dissolve and distribute themselves across the environments where a person spent their most significant moments, becoming woven into the very fabric of locations through accumulated emotion, memory, and existential imprint. The theory suggests that consciousness is not a discrete entity that either exists or ceases to exist, but rather a form of energetic residue that can permeate spaces, objects, and even the people who knew the deceased, spreading outward in concentric circles of diminishing intensity until it becomes indistinguishable from the ambient emotional atmosphere of a place. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates through our deeply human tendency to invest physical spaces with emotional meaning, and to experience profound grief as though it has spatial dimensions we can navigate, creating a comforting narrative in which loss is not absolute erasure, but rather a transformation into a different form of presence. We naturally project our internal emotional states onto external environments, interpreting the quietness of a childhood home as melancholy, the warmth of sunlight in a favorite room as the person's continuing embrace, and the way objects remain exactly as they left them as evidence of continued connection rather than mere stagnation. This theory persists across cultures and throughout history because it addresses one of human consciousness's most fundamental anxieties. That death represents a complete and irreversible severance, an interpretation that feels intolerable to minds evolved to maintain bonds and relationships as essential to survival and meaning. We continue to honor this belief by keeping rooms unchanged, preserving possessions, visiting graves and meaningful locations, and speaking of feeling presences in these spaces, all behaviors we have collectively normalized as natural expressions of grief, rather than recognizing them as investments in a metaphysical framework that science has never validated, yet which provides psychological comfort too valuable to abandon. And perhaps this is precisely why soul diffusion endures as a belief system. It transforms the unbearable finality of death into a poetic dispersal, allowing us to maintain relationship with those we have lost by reframing absence not as emptiness, but as a subtle omnipresence that requires only our willingness to feel it in the spaces they inhabited and the memories we continue to inhabit. In many cultures across the world, there exists a profound and deeply rooted belief that the living are fundamentally dependent upon their deceased ancestors for protection, guidance, prosperity, and even basic spiritual sustenance. A concept that manifests in practices ranging from regular ancestral veneration to elaborate funeral rites designed to ensure the comfort and satisfaction of those who have passed beyond the veil of mortality. This theory posits that the relationship between the living and the dead is not merely sentimental or spiritual in nature, but rather transactional and essential, operating under the assumption that ancestors retain agency and influence over the world of the living, and that neglecting them or failing to honor them properly can result in misfortune, illness, poverty, or unexplained calamity befalling one's family line. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system is rooted in several deeply human impulses: the need to maintain connection with those we have loved and lost, the desire to feel that their existence held lasting meaning beyond their physical death, and the fundamental human drive to find order and causation in a chaotic world where random suffering often strikes without warning or apparent reason. When something goes wrong in a family, the Ancestor Dependency framework provides a ready explanation that transforms meaningless tragedy into a narrative with purpose, suggesting that perhaps a ritual was neglected, an offering was forgotten, or a promise to the dead was broken, thereby restoring a sense of agency and control to the living who might otherwise feel powerless before fate. The remarkable persistence of this belief system, despite the absence of empirical evidence supporting the causal relationship between ancestral veneration and material outcomes, can be attributed to several reinforcing factors. Confirmation bias leads practitioners to remember the times when rituals were followed and good fortune followed, while forgetting the countless instances when misfortune occurred despite proper observance. And the cyclical nature of life ensures that there will always be both successes and failures to selectively interpret through the lens of ancestral influence. Furthermore, the institutionalization of ancestor dependency within religious and cultural frameworks means that questioning the belief becomes not merely an intellectual exercise, but a challenge to family identity, cultural continuity, and one's place within a historical lineage, making the psychological cost of skepticism far higher than the cost of simply continuing the traditions one has inherited. In societies where ancestor dependency is particularly pronounced, such as in many East Asian, African, and indigenous cultures, the veneration of ancestors becomes intertwined with social hierarchy, economic resource allocation, and even political legitimacy, as maintaining proper ancestral relationships can determine one's social standing and access to communal support systems that remain essential for survival and prosperity. In the late 19th century, as spiritualism swept across Europe and North America with unprecedented fervor, a particular vision of the afterlife emerged from seance rooms and spirit communications that would captivate millions of believers for generations to come. This vision, known as the Summerland, was allegedly described in extraordinary detail by spirit guides and departed souls who communicated through mediums, painting a portrait of existence beyond death that was strikingly beautiful, profoundly comforting, and disturbingly mundane all at once. According to these accounts, the Summerland was a place of eternal springtime and perfect weather, where landscapes remained perpetually verdant and flowers bloomed without ceasing, where architecture reflected classical ideals of beauty, and where the deceased inhabited homes and gardens that seemed to mirror their earthly desires and aesthetic preferences with uncanny precision. The theory proposed that upon death, souls would awaken in this realm already possessing their ideal physical form, free from disease and aging, capable of communicating with loved ones who had preceded them, and able to pursue intellectual, artistic, and spiritual development without the limitations of mortality. What made the Summerland particularly compelling to Victorian society was its fundamental conservatism, its promise that death would not strip away identity or comfort, but rather refine and perfect the life one had already lived, essentially offering a permanent vacation home stocked with all the pleasures of existence minus the inconveniences of bills and bodily functions. The psychological mechanism driving this belief system operated through a profound desire to deny the finality of death, while simultaneously refusing to accept the radical transformation that many religious traditions proposed the afterlife would entail, creating instead a middle ground where you could have eternal life and earthly contentment simultaneously. Mediums reporting these communications drew heavily upon contemporary Victorian aesthetics and values, describing landscapes and architecture that reflected the era's romanticization of nature and classical civilization, essentially channeling the collective unconscious desires of their audiences back to them as divine revelation, a process that felt like confirmation precisely because it reflected what people desperately wanted to believe. The Summerland persists in various forms within contemporary spiritualist movements and certain New Age belief systems, despite the complete absence of any verifiable evidence, surviving largely because it offers psychological reassurance that requires no leap of faith toward the unknown, asking believers to imagine merely that death is comparable to moving to a better neighborhood rather than entering an entirely alien mode of existence, making it infinitely easier to embrace than more austere or mysterious conceptions of what awaits beyond the grave. In certain spiritual and metaphysical traditions, particularly within some interpretations of animism, Hinduism, and Buddhist philosophy, the concept of afterlife transformation into plant life, specifically trees, represents one of the most literal interpretations of cosmic recycling and the dissolution of individual consciousness into the natural world. This theory proposes that upon death, the human soul or life force does not ascend to a heavenly realm or descend to an underworld, but instead becomes reincorporated into the physical matter and biological processes of a living tree, where consciousness allegedly persists in some form, experiencing an entirely different mode of existence characterized by stillness, rootedness, and the slow metabolic processes of wood growth. The individual does not retain memories or recognizable identity as they once knew it, but rather becomes distributed throughout the cellular structures, experiencing time in vast increments measured by seasons and centuries rather than moments and years, perceiving the world through the absorption of sunlight converted into chemical energy, through the slow drawing of nutrients from soil through invisible root systems, and through the connection to an entire ecosystem of insects, fungi, birds, and microorganisms that become part of its extended consciousness or being. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief stems from humanity's ancient observations of nature's perfect cycles of death and renewal, where fallen human bodies quite literally decompose and return to soil that nourishes new plant growth, creating a visible and undeniable continuation of material existence, if not spiritual persistence. Early human cultures, possessing less sophisticated scientific understanding than we do today, projected conscious experience onto this natural cycle, assuming that if matter could be recycled and reorganized, perhaps awareness could follow the same path, embedding itself within the tree just as the body embeds itself within the earth. What remains striking about this theory's persistence in modern times is that despite our contemporary scientific knowledge of biology, decomposition, and the absence of any measurable consciousness in plant organisms, the concept continues to exert a powerful emotional appeal across multiple contemporary spiritual movements, environmental philosophies, and even some modern funeral practices like natural burial that explicitly frame the return to Earth as a meaningful and intentional transformation rather than mere biological recycling, suggesting that we have not truly abandoned this ancient framework so much as we have repackaged and renormalized it within the language of environmental consciousness and ecological awareness. In this way, the fantasy of becoming a tree serves as a psychological bridge between our modern ecological anxieties and our ancient spiritual yearnings, allowing us to imagine that our inevitable return to the earth might constitute not an ending, but a subtle metamorphosis into something enduring, rooted, and eternally connected to the living world we will leave behind. When we examine what physically happens to the human body after death, we encounter a process so gradual and so complete that it challenges our fundamental sense of continuity and selfhood. The body begins to decompose almost immediately, with cellular breakdown occurring within minutes of cardiac arrest, followed by bacterial colonization and enzymatic degradation that over weeks and months transforms organized tissue into simpler organic compounds. This process accelerates through various environmental conditions, eventually resulting in the complete mineralization and dispersal of every atom that once comprised a person, with those atoms eventually scattering into soil, water, and air, potentially becoming part of plants, animals, and other humans through the natural biogeochemical cycles that sustain all life on Earth. The philosophical disturbance here operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, there is the mathematical certainty that every atom comprising your body will be redistributed and incorporated into countless other forms of matter and potentially countless other organisms, which means that in a material sense, no part of you will persist as anything resembling the unified entity you currently experience as yourself. Second, there is the unsettling implication that the atoms that compose you today have themselves been part of countless previous organisms, stretching back billions of years through evolutionary history, suggesting that we are not truly individuals, but rather temporary arrangements of ancient matter cycling endlessly through different configurations. What makes this theory particularly disturbing is how it undermines the notion of personal continuity and identity from a purely materialist perspective. For if consciousness and selfhood emerge from specific arrangements of atoms, then once those atoms disperse, there is nothing left to persist or continue. Yet despite the logical certainty of this process, and despite having no scientific evidence whatsoever that this dispersal results in any form of continuity, consciousness, or survival, many people maintain a subtle emotional resistance to fully accepting the implications of their own atomic dissolution, perhaps because the idea feels simultaneously too vast and too minute to carry genuine weight in how we construct meaning around mortality. This resistance persists even as we casually acknowledge that we shed roughly 30,000 dead skin cells per minute, that we replace nearly every atom in our bodies over the course of 7 to 10 years, and that we are quite literally not the same physical entity we were a decade ago. a truth that somehow feels less final than contemplating our eventual complete dispersal, perhaps because gradual replacement preserves the illusion of continuity while total dissolution does not.